Hello, wanderer. Come in quietly. This is Echoes of the Forgotten Earth, and tonight we're not chasing a headline or a shock or a secret that wants to be screamed. Tonight we're doing something older and slower. We're letting curiosity walk barefoot, and we're letting science dim its lantern just enough for imagination to breathe. I want to offer you a question that doesn't demand you answer it. A question that behaves more like a lullaby than a puzzle. What if the first civilization, not merely the earliest we've found, but the first one that truly learned how to be human, never actually vanished? What if it didn't disappear the way a city disappears, but changed its method? What if the guidance we think we're missing never stopped, only the language we use to understand it did? Right away, let's set something down gently. This is not a promise of proof. This is not an invitation to conspiracies, coded maps, or neat villains hiding in the dust. This is the kind of story you hold in your hands like warm clay. You turn it, you press it, you see what shape it takes. And if it cracks, that's fine. Some things are meant to be contemplated, not captured. Where are you listening from tonight? Maybe you're on a porch where the air still tastes faintly of rain on concrete. Maybe you're in a room where the refrigerator hums like a distant engine, steady and indifferent. Maybe you're in a car parked somewhere quiet, letting the world pass without you for a while. Wherever you are, take one slow breath. Let your shoulders fall from their usual place. Let your jaw unclench. There's nothing to solve immediately. We can take the long road. If we're going to talk about the first civilization, we should begin with a truth that feels almost impolite to say out loud. We don't actually know where civilization began. Not the way we know where a river begins, with a finger on a map and a confident name. We have sites. We have dates. We have pottery shards and charred seeds and bones arranged with care. We have lists, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, Norte Chico names that look tidy in textbooks. But the earth doesn't keep its records in neat binders. The line between first and forgotten is thin, and it moves every time we dig. For a long time, we told ourselves a comforting story. Civilization began around 10,000 years ago, when humans settled down, planted fields, domesticated animals, and built permanent homes. It's a clean narrative. It has a beginning that feels like a door opening, but the ground keeps interrupting us. Time keeps backing away like a shoreline when the tide turns. There are places with stone architecture that appear too early. There are carvings that feel like memory rather than invention. There are sites that seem to carry organization, geometry, coordination before we think they should. And every new excavation nudges the timeline farther back, as if the planet is revealing the truth in careful sips, not a spill. Sometimes it feels like the Earth is shy. And then there are the structures that don't fit comfortably inside the timeline we've built in our minds. Massive stones cut and joined so tightly you want to run your fingernail along the seam just to reassure yourself it's real. Layouts that suggest surveying and measurement. Alignments that imply patient observation of the sky. Not because the builders were mystical, but because they were attentive. Because they watched and they remembered what they saw. When we encounter these things, the question rises quietly, stubbornly, without needing to be dramatic. Did we build all this from nothing? Did we start at bare hands and blank minds and climb, step by step, all on our own? Or did we inherit a seed, an intuition, a method, a tendency, planted long before we learned how to write it down? It's tempting to imagine human history as a straight road, primitive to advanced, scattered to organized, myth to science. But the earth doesn't move in straight lines. Rivers loop, forests burn and return, ice grinds mountains down and then retreats, letting new life creep in. If nature works in cycles, why would we be the exception? Maybe civilization is not a single sunrise. Maybe it's a tide. A civilization rises, concentrates knowledge, builds with intention. Then something changes, climate shifts, droughts lengthen, coasts flood, volcanoes throw ash like a curtain, ice melts and redraws the maps. The civilization falters, fragments, migrates, The monuments crack, the stories grow thin, but not everything is lost. Some things survive, not as buildings, but as habits. Not as books, but as instincts. Not as proof, but as patterns. That's the thought I want us to hold tonight. That the earliest civilization might have been less an empire and more a way of noticing. Because what is the first step of civilization, really? Is it walls? Is it agriculture? Is it writing? Or is it the moment a group of people begins to pay steady attention to the long rhythms of the world and to preserve that attention across generations? Imagine a community that measured time, not by clocks, but by light. A community that knew intimately where the sun rose on the longest day and where it fell on the shortest. A community that watched the moon tug at the sea and recognized the pattern as a kind of language. A community that learned the stars not as decoration, but as a map, seasonal, reliable, precise. They may not have called it astronomy. They may not have had a word for mathematics the way we do, but they could have lived inside the principles. They could have understood without naming, the way a musician understands harmony before they can explain it. And if that was the first civilization, then maybe its greatest legacy wasn't a monument at all. Maybe it was a framework of attention, a habit of mind that could survive when everything else broke. When you think about it, the Earth itself is an archive built from layers, rock pressed into pages, sediment laid down like paragraphs, ocean floors storing histories in silence, ice holding trapped air from ancient atmospheres like a breath saved in glass. Civilizations, too, leave layers. But the layers aren't always what we expect. We want ruins, because ruins are visible. We want artifacts, because artifacts fit in museums. But influence doesn't always fossilize into objects. Sometimes it fossilizes into behavior. We see it in the strange way certain breakthroughs in human history feel less like invention and more like recognition, as if the mind stumbles into a room it's never entered, and yet it knows where the furniture is. Ancient alloys that show up earlier than expected, instruments that imply careful observation, medical techniques hinted at in unexpected places, knowledge surfacing like a bone after rain, and then myths. Always myths. Nearly every culture holds stories about teachers who arrived from somewhere else. Sometimes they come from the sea, sometimes from the sky. Sometimes they emerge from caves or mountains, luminous and strange, carrying gifts. Agriculture, calendars, laws, measurements, star knowledge. We dismiss these as fantasy, and sometimes they are. But myths are not random. Myths are containers. When you don't have paper, you store truth in story. When you can't preserve exact facts, you preserve patterns. You preserve the shape of events. A flood destroys the old world. Survivors begin again. A fire remakes the land. Teachings are carried forward. A teacher arrives, not because they're divine, but because they know something others don't. Over centuries, the teacher becomes a hero. Over more centuries, the hero becomes a god. Over more centuries, the god becomes a bedtime story told so often the room itself learns the rhythm. But the memory endures. Have you ever stood in a museum in front of a statue whose eyes seem too alive for stone? That feeling, the strange familiarity, can be unsettling. Not because the statue is magical, but because intention is persistent. The sculptor's attention, the patience, the choice to shape the world into meaning, those things survive. They reach across time like a hand reaching through fog. History, in those moments, doesn't feel behind you. It feels beside you. Now imagine this. Somewhere beneath your feet, under the sidewalks and the roots and the buried riverbeds, there is a memory of the first people who looked up at the night sky and realized it could be understood. Not worshipped in fear, not ignored as randomness understood. Maybe their knowledge wasn't written in a language we could decode. Maybe it was embedded in alignments, in layouts, in stone placed where light would touch it at specific times. Maybe it was built into the environment as a kind of durable teaching, a lesson that could survive even when vocabulary died. Some researchers call this kind of idea cultural amnesia, the possibility that human history is longer and more cyclical than our neat timelines suggest. Catastrophes could erase cities. Sea level rise could bury coasts. The majority of our planet is water, and most of the seafloor remains unmapped in detail. Entire chapters could be underwater, their sentences dissolved into sand, their punctuation scattered by currents. If a civilization existed on ancient shorelines, the ocean would have swallowed its evidence with calm efficiency. And yet, what if the evidence is not only physical? What if the inheritance is also internal? Our brains are astonishing machines for keeping records. Not perfect, but persistent. We carry personal memory, of course, but we also carry instincts, predispositions, urges that feel older than our own experience. Modern research into epigenetics suggests that certain experiences can leave marks that pass through generations. Stress responses, metabolic shifts, subtle tendencies encoded not in our stories, but in our chemistry. If that's true, then it's not absurd to wonder whether certain aspects of human nature, our restless curiosity, our urge to measure, to build, to map the sky, to store seeds, to preserve knowledge could be inheritances too. Not a direct download of ancient facts, but a direction, a bias, a compass needle. Think about how every generation, no matter what it knows, returns to the same fascinations. The stars, the ocean, the origin of consciousness, the question of what we are. We build better tools, telescopes, submersibles, microscopes, but the subjects remain. The questions persist. Sometimes discovery feels like déjà vu. What if the guidance we're looking for isn't a voice from above, but a memory from below, rising through us the way spring rises through soil? What if the first civilization speaks not in words, but in the very architecture of our attention? When people feel drawn to certain landscapes, ancient ruins, wind-scoured plateaus, places where the air seems heavy with quiet, it might not be romance. It might be recognition at a level deeper than language. The ground beneath those places carries patterns, alignments, old pathways, subtle contours shaped by human hands long ago. Even if the stones are gone, the land remembers being arranged with purpose. Picture standing on a high plain at dusk. The soil is thin. The wind tastes like distance. You can't name what you feel, but it feels like being watched, not by a creature, but by time itself. The horizon leans forward slightly, as if it's listening. In that moment, you're both observer and continuation. Another page in a book that began long before alphabets. There are patterns archaeologists and astronomers keep noticing when they compare ancient sites across cultures. Alignments toward recurring stars and constellations. Orion, Sirius, clusters like the Pleiades celestial markers that appear again and again across continents and ages. It could be coincidence, it could be universal human interest in the brightest lights in the sky, or it could be something like a shared curriculum. Look up, remember, record. Even the symbols recur. Spirals, grids, circles, lines that seem simple until you see them everywhere. Carved into stones, painted onto pottery, woven into cloth. Maybe they're universal because they mirror the sun and moon, the seasons, the turning of life itself. Or maybe they're remnants of a symbolic language older than we know, a protocode that survived because it was easy to remember and impossible to fully erase. And then, there's a question we don't ask often enough. Why are we so obsessed with permanence? Why does our species keep trying to build things that outlast us? Pyramids, cathedrals, data centers, satellites, time capsules, archives carved into mountains. We send probes into interstellar space with messages on them, as if the universe itself might one day read our name. Maybe that's instinct. Maybe it's vanity. Maybe it's fear. Or maybe it's inheritance. a quiet instruction passed down from a people who learned the hard truth that civilizations can vanish and decided to leave memory in forms that could survive. When we map DNA, preserve seeds, store libraries in cold vaults, we're doing with data what ancient builders did with stone, pushing a message forward through time. Remember us. Continue. Some people find comfort in believing guidance comes from gods or fate. Others see guidance as a poetic word for evolution and continuity. But maybe it's simpler. Maybe guidance is just memory, the world remembering itself through us. The atoms in your body were forged in stars. The calcium in your bones may have once been part of a reef. The air in your lungs has cycled through leaves older than any city. If matter is recycled endlessly, why wouldn't knowledge be recycled too? Humanity's timeline is astonishingly compressed. From stone blades to satellites in what amounts to a geological blink. 10,000 years is almost nothing. It makes you wonder whether the blueprint was ever truly blank. Whether we were learning from scratch or remembering how to build. Some scientists call it cumulative culture. Knowledge stacked generation upon generation, accelerating because each layer supports the next. But what if the very first layer wasn't ours? What if it was inherited from a civilization so ancient its visible form is gone, leaving only frameworks, impulses, habits of mind? We may never find definitive proof. The past is fragile. Most of it has already become dust. But absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially when the ocean holds so much of our story, and when the earth is skilled at swallowing its own evidence. Every discovery begins as imagination. Every civilization begins as a story told near warmth. So tonight, as you settle deeper into whatever holds you, chair, bed, the hush of a parked car, think about the ground beneath you. Under that thin crust are the remains of countless lives, pottery, bone, ash, seeds, footprints turned to stone. People who looked up at the same stars you can see tonight, if your sky is clear enough. Maybe the guidance we're waiting for isn't coming from above. Maybe it's coming from below, through the layers, through the quiet, through the things that refuse to stop echoing. And if we keep following those echoes patiently, gently, we might begin to notice the repeating shapes that connect us. The way we build, the way we measure, the way we dream of permanence, patterns that suggest the first civilization didn't vanish, it changed form. The sun rises somewhere, as it always has, carrying the same warmth it once poured onto valleys before cities existed, when silence and sky were the only architecture. And every morning is a kind of reminder. Beginnings are not explosions. They are dawns. They spread slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day the light reaches a new place, and we call it history. Tonight we're still in that half-light, the place where shapes exist but names haven't settled. And that's where echoes live. If you've ever watched the horizon before sunrise, you know how the world looks just before it admits the day. The trees are there, the hills are there, the outline of a road is there, but everything is softened, unfinished, as if reality itself is still deciding what it wants to be. That is what the earliest record of civilization feels like. Not darkness, not emptiness, just a half-formed clarity. We have traces, stones placed with intent, bones arranged in careful lines, pigments ground and pressed into cave walls with a tenderness that still feels personal. But the people behind those traces are mostly invisible. Their names didn't survive. Their jokes and arguments didn't survive. Their voices, those exact vibrations in the air, are gone. What remains is behavior fossilized into matter. The record isn't a biography. It's a silhouette. Archaeologists like to speak in thresholds, fire, tools, farming, writing, cities, as if humanity stepped cleanly from one room to another and shut the door behind itself. But thresholds in real life aren't doors. They're shorelines. They move, they blur, they leave tidal debris, half old, half new. Farming didn't begin in one valley on one day. It seeped into human life gradually. People gathered wild grains, learned the seasons, cleared patches, saved the seeds that behaved best. Over time, the plants changed, and so did we. Writing, too, didn't erupt fully formed. It had a long prehistory of counting, tokens, marks, knots, memory aids. Civilization didn't switch on. It simmered, which is why certain places unsettle us, because they look like someone skipped steps. There are sites, real ones, excavated ones, where the timeline feels uncooperative. Places where you can almost sense the academic hesitation in the air, the careful language in papers, the cautious footnotes, because the stones are saying something the narrative doesn't want to hear. Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey is one of those places. Built more than 11,000 years ago, before what we usually call civilization, it sits like a deep exhale at the edge of our certainty. Massive T-shaped pillars, carved with animals and symbols, arranged in circles with deliberate geometry. It required planning, organization, and artistry. It required people who could coordinate labor at scale. And according to the neat story we used to tell ourselves, it shouldn't exist. Agriculture was supposed to come first. Permanent settlements, then surplus, then complexity, then temples. But Göbekli Tepe looks like a temple before farming, a gathering place built by people who were still, by many measures, supposed to be hunter-gatherers. So we have to ask, did the sequence we rely on, this comfortable ladder of progress, reflect reality? Or is it just a way our minds prefer to arrange events? Sometimes it seems like humans didn't invent civilization as much as they remembered a reason to gather, a reason to align, a reason to build something bigger than daily survival. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Along coastlines, underwater, in places the sea keeps to itself, there are shapes that make people argue. Submerged stone formations off India, Japan, the Mediterranean. Some of them likely geological, yes, but some of them carry angles and repetition that look stubbornly intentional. The ocean is a skilled eraser, but it is not a perfect one. Sometimes it leaves just enough to make you stare longer than you planned. Imagine the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago. Sea levels were lower, coastlines were different. Entire plains now drowned were once livable, fertile, busy. Climate was unstable. Long droughts, sudden floods, shifting seasons. Human populations were smaller, yes, but far from simple. They traveled, they traded, they created art so sophisticated it still humbles modern eyes. If you've seen cave paintings, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, you know what I mean. The animals move, the lines carry weight. The painters understood proportion, motion, emotion. They used the curves of cave walls to give dimension. That is not primitive. That is perception sharpened by attention. Perception, stretched across generations, becomes science. Now consider what happens when coastlines shift. When glaciers melt, the sea rises, swallowing the places where people tend to cluster. Near water, near food, near transportation routes. If an early civilization favored coasts, and why wouldn't it? Then much of its physical evidence would now be underwater, buried under silt, dissolved, pressed into the slow memory of the seafloor. And if catastrophe struck, floods, eruptions, earthquakes, the few survivors would carry what mattered most, not walls, not statues, but techniques. A method of planting, a way to read the sky, a memory of how to stack stones so they hold. That's how knowledge survives, not as objects, as behaviors. There's a quiet idea among some researchers that civilization is not a straight line but a rhythm. Advance, collapse, forget, rediscover. Each cycle leaves behind fragments, tools, myths, habits that the next cycle picks up without fully understanding where they came from. The melody repeats even when the instruments change. This could explain why similar inventions show up in places that seem unconnected. Agriculture, pyramidal forms, calendars, flood myths, basic geometry, ritual alignment with celestial events. We call it independent invention, and sometimes it is. The human mind is capable of arriving at the same solutions when faced with the same world. But independent invention doesn't have to exclude inheritance. The same way a child can invent sentences using grammar, it never consciously studied because the framework is already inside it. A culture can invent within a framework it inherited without knowing. And our myths, those patient carriers, are full of hints. Flood stories, for example, appear nearly everywhere. Mesopotamia, India, the Americas, Pacific Islands, Northern Europe. They vary in detail, but they keep a shape. An earlier world washed away. Survivors carry seeds, tools, knowledge. A new age begins. We treat these as morality tales or archetypes, and they are, yet archetypes often form around something real. A major flood at the end of the Ice Age is not fantasy, it's geology. Meltwater pulses, sea level rise, sudden breaches of natural dams. These events were not subtle. They would have been life-altering. And if coastal settlements existed, they would have been destroyed. A survivor who knew how to plant, how to track seasons, how to align stones with solstices would have seemed impossible to the people they met inland. Not divine, just different. They would have carried a technology of attention, a way of living that made the world less random. Over time, that difference becomes myth. The teacher becomes a god. The boat becomes a sacred symbol. The flood becomes a universal story told in 100 languages, each one insisting, "We have been here before. We began again." This is not about romanticizing catastrophe. It's about acknowledging how fragile the material record is and how strong behavioral memory can be. We often underestimate oral tradition because we live inside paper and pixels. But before writing, humans still memorize vast amounts of information. Star positions, seasonal cycles, genealogies, laws, medicinal knowledge. Some indigenous Australian songlines encode navigation and ecological details that may reach back tens of thousands of years. A song becomes a map. A rhythm becomes a route. A story becomes a library. That's not quaint. That's precision disguised as beauty. So when we ask whether the first civilization could still guide us, we should consider that the guidance might be encoded in forms that survive without appearing scientific. In festival dates timed to solstices. In taboo rules that preserve ecosystems. In myths that warn about tides and fire and the hunger of rivers. In stories that seem supernatural until you recognize they're carrying a pattern of survival. Language itself might carry the residue. Linguists have traced families of languages backward, reconstructing ancestral forms with remarkable discipline. Some have proposed the possibility of a deep common origin, an ancient proto-language spoken before migration spread humans across continents. Whether or not a single origin can be proven, the impulse matters. Language leaves fossils. And language is not just words. It's architecture of thought. Grammar shapes how minds connect events, cause and effect, time and possibility, self and other. If early humans inherited a way of thinking, an orientation toward measurement, toward pattern, then even modern minds might be running ancient software. Look closely at the oldest written records we have. Sumerian accounting tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, early calendars and measurements. They don't look like a first attempt. They look mature, structured, rule-based. As if writing appears not as a toddler's scribble, but as a practiced hand finally finding a more permanent medium, which suggests a long oral prehistory of counting, measuring, observing. That kind of observation is slow. It doesn't fit neatly inside a single lifetime. To track long-term cycles like precession, that gradual wobble that shifts the stars over millennia, you need generations committed to careful record-keeping. Not necessarily written record, but ritual record. Alignments repeated, stories retold, markers maintained. When you stand at ancient sites and see their alignments, solstice windows, equinox shadows, stones pointing toward a particular sunrise, you're looking at time made physical. architecture used as a calendar, stone used as a memory device. And this appears again and again across cultures. The Passage Tomb at Newgrange in Ireland, where winter solstice light reaches deep into the chamber for a brief moment, illuminating carvings that have waited all year for that touch. The monumental alignments at ancient complexes in the Americas, where buildings catch and shape the sun's movement into shadow serpents and bright ladders. The careful orientation of temples in Egypt and elsewhere that track cardinal directions with precision that makes you pause. People call this worship, and sometimes it was. But worship and measurement are not enemies. A person can be awed and accurate at the same time. In fact, awe often sharpens attention. If you believe the sky matters, you watch it more carefully. If you watch carefully, you learn. Which brings us to one of the most persistent puzzles: the way ancient societies seem to share certain celestial fixations. Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades, bright anchors in the night that reappear as sacred guides in distant places. Maybe it's simply because they're obvious. They're easy to find. They're reliable. But patterns that repeat across continents can still raise quiet questions. If the same stars served as guides again and again, perhaps each culture was not only observing independently, but inheriting a tradition of observation. A shared assignment passed forward. Use the sky as your stable reference when the world below changes. Because the sky is the one monument that doesn't erode. It returns every night. The stars don't sink beneath the ocean. They don't crumble into dust. Even when clouds hide them, you know they're still there. If you wanted to leave guidance across millennia, you couldn't choose a better anchor than the heavens. It's the ultimate public record. The only calendar that never closes. And perhaps that's why humans, no matter the era, keep building permanence. It's not only vanity, it's a response to a deep awareness that memory is fragile, that floodwaters can erase, fires can swallow, languages can drift. So we build in stone, we build in ritual, we build in story, we build in aligned corridors that trap sunlight once a year like a letter delivered on a schedule. We build, in other words, because we are trying to keep a conversation going. Sometimes I imagine the first civilization not as a single empire, but as a network of observers scattered along coasts and rivers, people who traded not only goods, but methods, techniques for reading tides, ways to measure shadows, knots for keeping count, songs that mapped the land and the stars. They may not have worn crowns. They may not have called themselves a civilization at all. They may simply have been humans who decided that the world was understandable and worth remembering. Then disaster, then dispersal, then forgetting. And yet, in the next stage, the same patterns reemerge. Measured fields, planted grains, stones aligned, myths retold. The torch passes, not brightly, not cleanly, but enough. This is the heart of the thought. Civilization may be less a creation than a continuation. Every generation believes it's inventing something new, and in the details, it is. But the impulses are older. The hunger to preserve, the need to align, the instinct to measure time, the yearning to make a mark that outlasts the body. Why do we do that? Why do we keep attempting permanence even knowing we're temporary? Perhaps because someone long ago learned painfully that without permanence, memory dissolves. And perhaps that lesson survived, not as a command, but as a habit. We preserve seeds in vaults now. We store data in servers buried under mountains. We launch probes with golden records into the dark between stars. We do all of this because we can't bear the idea that our awareness might leave no trace. It's the same motive ancient builders had when they placed stones carefully enough to catch a solstice sunrise centuries later. Same motive, different materials. So, if you're willing, let's take the thought one step farther. Let's imagine that the first civilization understood the most basic problem of existence. The world changes faster than memory. Floods rewrite coastlines. Ice ages rearrange the planet. Earthquakes crack cities. Knowledge can die in a single generation if no one carries it. If you were them and you wanted to guide the future, what would you do? You wouldn't rely on language alone. Language shifts. You wouldn't rely on books. Books burn. You wouldn't rely on monuments alone. Monuments collapse. You would choose something more durable than materials. You would choose patterns, alignments, cycles, rhythms, and you would seed those patterns into culture so deeply that even when people forgot why, they would still repeat them. A festival at the right time of year, a taboo against cutting certain trees, a story warning of water's return, a geometry repeated in weaving, a spiral carved because the spiral feels true. And perhaps most powerfully, you would seed the pattern into the human mind itself, into curiosity, into the urge to map, into the restlessness that refuses to accept mystery as final. Because curiosity is a kind of inheritance. It's the one thing that keeps rebuilding the world after every collapse. As the night continues, notice how your own mind responds to these ideas. You don't need to decide what's true. Just notice the feeling, the slow stirring of recognition, the possibility that what we call progress might be memory returning through new hands. And somewhere under all of it, the earth keeps turning, quietly holding its layers, refusing to reveal everything at once. That's what an archive does. It waits until you're ready to read it. There are things the world keeps, even when it lets everything else go. Paper turns to pulp. Wood becomes soil. Metal blooms with rust and returns to ore. But stone is stubborn. Stone is what the earth uses when it wants to remember. That's why so much of what we call ancient still reaches us through rock. Pillars, circles, terraces, blocks stacked with a patience that feels almost inhuman until you remember it was human hands that did it. If the first civilization left a message, it makes sense that it would be written in the one material that can survive weather, fire, and forgetting. And yet even stone isn't immortal. It cracks, it falls, it is swallowed by sand or tide. Its miracle isn't that it lasts forever. Its miracle is that it lasts long enough for someone else to come along and wonder what it meant. Imagine walking through a site where the walls rise only to your knees, where the air smells faintly of dust and distance. Nothing there looks dramatic at first. You could step over the stones without realizing you stepped over decisions. But if you slow down, you begin to feel the deliberateness in the placements. A corner that holds. A line that faces something. A gap that frames the horizon the way a picture frame holds light. A stone laid with intention is a sentence in a language that doesn't require ink. Long before alphabets, long before clay tablets, people stacked, carved, balanced, and oriented stone in ways that conveyed meaning. The meaning wasn't always linguistic. Sometimes it was practical shelter, boundary, storage. Sometimes it was ceremonial gathering, mourning, marking time. Often it was astronomical, a way of turning the sky's rhythms into something you could walk through. Stone is a slow medium. It demands commitment. If you move 20 tons of rock, you don't do it on a whim. You do it because the act itself matters. Because the result is meant to outlast the moment. That's why early archaeologists, faced with the scale and precision of megalithic structures, sometimes reached for supernatural explanations. Giants, gods, outsiders. It was easier to imagine the impossible than to imagine patient intelligence existing too early. But the more we learn, the more the mystical explanations shrink. Humans, given time and purpose, can do astonishing things. Precision doesn't require modern machines. It requires observation, coordination, and the willingness to repeat a task until it is right. Take Stonehenge overstudied, photographed, mythologized. It isn't the oldest, and it isn't the largest, but it is a clear example of something important. Stone as a device. Some of its blocks weigh more than 20 tons. Some were brought from far away, and the arrangement isn't random. The circle speaks to the sky. On the summer solstice, the sun rises in a way that fits the architecture as if the architecture was built to catch it, because it was. Whether Stonehenge was a calendar, a ceremonial site, a communal project of identity, it does one thing unmistakably. It ties human time to celestial time. It says, with a clarity no language can improve, we are watching, we are keeping track. And Stonehenge is part of a global habit. Malta has temples older than the pyramids. Senegal has stone circles that still keep their quiet geometry. The Andes carry terraces and sanctuaries oriented to peaks and sun paths. Across continents, separate cultures, some separated not only by distance but by millennia built using the same principles. Alignment, proportion, symmetry, repetition. You can argue it's universal human perception and you wouldn't be wrong. But universality has a flavor. It feels like inheritance even when it's independent, like different branches of the same ancient tree. Because the sky is shared, light is shared, time is shared. So the same questions produce the same constructions. But there's another possibility I can't quite put down, that later builders were following rules they didn't fully understand anymore. Ritual outliving reason, practice surviving explanation. In many ancient places you can see the evidence of reuse. A newer wall built atop older blocks, a temple rebuilt from the stones of an earlier temple. Sometimes the older stones are cut more precisely than the newer ones, as if the later builders inherited the material, but not the full method. It's one of those details that makes your mind pause, because it suggests a pattern. Knowledge can degrade, even while culture continues. People rebuild because rebuilding is what you do, but the deep technique can fade, leaving only imitation. And imitation, repeated long enough, becomes tradition. Consider the pyramid not as a symbol, but as an instinct. The form appears in Egypt, Sudan, Mesoamerica, China, and elsewhere, in variations that share a common logic. Wide base, narrowing toward the sky, weight distributed, stable geometry. It resists time. It wants to endure. We like to treat pyramids as signatures of specific civilizations, but the shape itself is almost inevitable once you start thinking in stone. If you want height and stability, the pyramid is what your hands will discover. Still, the precision of certain pyramids remains astonishing. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns with cardinal directions with remarkable accuracy. Its engineering suggests surveying knowledge, geometry, logistics refined, not accidental. Systems don't appear perfect in a single jump. They evolve or they are inherited. It's possible the builders of Egypt were continuing older practices that had already been tested somewhere else. Someone else. A lineage of technique passed down until its origin disappeared into prehistory. And then there are the joints, the places where stone meets stone. Sites like Pumapunku in Bolivia unsettle people not because they prove something exotic, but because they refuse to be casually explained. Massive blocks fitted so tightly that seams nearly vanish. Surfaces flattened with care. Angles cut with consistency. Interlocking joints that suggest forethought. Modern engineers debate methods. Some propose stone could be shaped with abrasion and patience, with sand and water and endless labor. Others consider lost techniques. Either way, the stone itself remains the fact. Someone wanted it to fit that way, and wanting is not the same as guessing. Wanting implies a standard. A standard implies instruction. At some sites, this precision appears alongside geometric repetition blocks, shaped in consistent modules, as if someone understood design not as improvisation, but as system. System building is a hallmark of civilization, not because it requires bureaucracy, but because it requires abstraction, the ability to think in units, to replicate, to plan beyond the immediate. When you map ancient sites globally, other patterns emerge that make people uncomfortable. Not because they're impossible, but because they invite questions we're not sure how to ask without sounding naive. Some monuments share latitudinal relationships. Some align along lines that suggest geometry at a planetary scale. Some distances and placements echo mathematical ratios. It's easy to dismiss this as pattern-seeking, a human tendency to find meaning where none was intended. And we should be careful. The mind is a hungry pattern machine. But it's also true that ancient people were capable of astonishing observation. You don't have to imagine satellites for them to understand latitude, horizon, shadow length, cardinal directions. With sticks, stones, and time, you can measure more than most modern people realize. The sky is a precise instrument if you're patient enough to use it. So perhaps some of these global patterns aren't accidents at all. Perhaps they're remnants of a shared approach, a geometry of Earth learned and repeated. If the first civilization existed as a network rather than a single city-state, if it was more like a tradition of observers who traveled and taught, then the repetition of certain building languages makes sense. Knowledge spreads faster than populations. A method can migrate even when a culture's name does not. And stone is the perfect medium for migrating methods. You don't need to carry it far if you can teach people how to use what they have. But stone isn't only about sight, it's also about sound. In some ancient chambers, the air behaves strangely. The walls hold echoes in ways that feel deliberate. Researchers studying archaeoacoustics have found that certain rooms resonate at particular frequencies, sometimes near the range of human voice. Chant inside them and the sound thickens, overlaps, becomes physical. It's not magic, it's resonance. Architecture shaping vibration. You can feel it in your chest when a note lingers too long, when the chamber seems to hum back at you. Was that accidental? Or did ancient builders understand that sound can alter perception? That vibration can move through the body as much as through air? If it was intentional, then stone monuments were not only markers of time, they were instruments. They were ways of tuning the human mind, calming it, focusing it, lifting it into a shared state of attention. And attention, once shared, is power. Not political power, cognitive power. The ability to align many minds with one purpose. That might be the most underrated technology of early civilizations. Coordinated focus. There's also a quieter, stranger thread that runs through certain materials. In geology, some crystals generate electrical charge under pressure, a property known as piezoelectricity. Quartz does this. Granite often contains quartz. Many ancient structures incorporate quartz-rich stone. Is that coincidence? It might be. Quartz is common. But it's also possible ancient builders noticed subtle effects, static, vibration, the way certain stones seem to hold sound or respond to touch differently. They might not have had voltmeters, but they had bodies. They had skin. They had the ability to notice. Early science doesn't begin with instruments. It begins with sensation. In that light, ancient monuments can be seen as experiments made durable. Calibrations in stone. Data preserved not in numbers but in form. Alignment, symmetry, resonance. If you wanted to pass knowledge forward without relying on language, you could do worse than building a structure that demonstrates a principle every year when the sun rises through it. A lesson that repeats on schedule, requiring no translation. It's a brilliant method because it turns the universe into the teacher. Stand here, watch. The light will prove it. And perhaps that's what the first civilization understood, that permanence is communication. Not permanence of buildings, but permanence of principles. When you build in alignment with what is constant, sunrise, solstice, star paths, you build a message that remains readable even when cultures change, even when names vanish. All that is required is someone willing to look. There's something humbling about how stones outlast not only individual lives, but entire empires. Many ancient blocks have been repurposed again and again. A temple becomes a quarry for a fortress. A tomb becomes a chapel. An older wall becomes the foundation for a newer one. Stone doesn't care who owns it. Stone just persists. In that persistence, you can almost see the continuity of civilization as recycling. Ideas and materials reused, translated, misunderstood, improved, degraded, reimagined. A long conversation where each generation adds a few words and erases a few others. Even our modern world is built from stone, just disguised Concrete is powdered limestone. Glass is melted sand. Steel is iron mined from the earth's deep bones. Our cities are geological rearrangements. We are still stacking the planet into meaning, and we still mark the dead with stone. Gravestones are small megaliths' names carved because we fear forgetting. A slab placed because we want a trace to remain. It's the same impulse that pushed ancient hands to place one rock atop another for reasons we can only guess. So maybe the first civilization's most enduring influence wasn't a specific site or technique. Maybe it was the realization that building is memory, that shaping the environment is a way to speak to the future. That's a powerful idea to plant in a species, because once a species inherits it, it will never stop building, even when it doesn't know why. If you ever find yourself at an ancient site, try something before you analyze it, before you photograph it, before you reach for a name. Stand still. Let your eyes soften. Listen, not for voices, but for the way the place holds silence differently. The stones won't speak in language, but they respond to attention. They feel different when witnessed, as if the act of looking completes the circuit. Civilization in that sense isn't only ruins, it's relationship. The long relationship between human intention and stubborn matter. And as the night moves deeper quiet, patient consider the possibility that the stones we call relics are not only remains, they're participants. They are still doing their work, holding alignments, keeping time, offering patterns to anyone who comes close enough to notice. If the first civilization is still guiding us, perhaps it is guiding us exactly this way, through the habit of building, through the stubbornness of stone, through principles that endure because the universe itself repeats them. And if you follow that threadstone to sky, alignment to attention, you begin to feel how the story might move upward. Because the sky, after all, is where the earliest builders aimed their architecture. The stars were their oldest archive, and that is where we'll drift next. The sky has always been our oldest screen. Before we had ink, before we had walls high enough to paint, before we had names for months or hours, there was the night overhead, dark enough to make fire precious, open enough to make wondering inevitable. Every generation has looked up into that same deep field of light and felt the same quiet pull. This means something. Not because the stars are trying to impress us, not because the universe is obligated to be readable, but because the human mind is built to notice patterns, and the sky is generous with them. When we talk about the first civilization, we tend to look down at ruins, at pottery, at the broken edges of things we can hold. But perhaps we should look up instead, because if there is any record that can survive ice ages, floods, migration, and forgetting, it isn't stone. It's the sky itself. The stars don't crumble, they don't sink, they don't rot. Night after night, they return. Even when clouds erase them temporarily, the pattern is still there behind the veil, waiting. The sky is the only monument humanity has never needed to rebuild. It's the one archive that time cannot bury. It's easy to underestimate what early humans could know, because we picture them through a lens of convenience, as vague observers with simple lives, noticing only the obvious. But simple life does not mean simple mind. In fact, a life close to natural cycles can sharpen observation until it becomes expertise. Long before telescopes, people tracked eclipses. They watched planets wander against the fixed stars. They recognized that the same constellations returned in the same seasons. They saw that the moon governed tides and that the sun governed everything else. They didn't need equations to recognize law. They needed consistency. They needed time. They needed elders who remembered what the young had not yet lived long enough to confirm. And if you want to build knowledge that outlasts you, that's how you do it. You pass the watching forward. There are ancient sites that make this continuity undeniable. Stone circles aligned to solstice sunrises. Corridors built to catch a single shaft of light on one day of the year. Markers positioned so that a bright star appears exactly where you need it to appear, season after season, like a clock you can read with your body. To do this once is impressive. To do it across generations is civilization. Because that kind of precision is not a one-person achievement. It is a tradition. You can feel it in places like Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, where stones were arranged in ways that align with the summer solstice sunrise thousands of years before the pyramids. Or in Ireland, at Newgrange, where winter solstice light slides along a passage and fills the chamber for minutes as if delivering a yearly letter. Or in the Americas, where architecture catches equinox sunlight and turns it into a moving shadow that behaves like a planned illusion. People sometimes call these things ritual, as if ritual is the opposite of knowledge. But ritual can be knowledge made durable. If you want a community to remember a date forever, you don't hand them a chart. You build them a sunrise they can't ignore. You weave the memory into their bodies. You make it social. You make it sacred. Then it survives. This is one reason myths matter more than we like to admit. Myths are not always lies. Myths are compression. They are the mind's way of storing complex observations in a form that can survive loss of context. They preserve patterns when exact measurements are too fragile to carry. Some researchers believe ancient observers encoded astronomical cycles into story. A god devouring the sun could be an eclipse. A serpent chasing the sky could be a planet's path. A battle between siblings could mirror seasonal transitions. When you don't have a scientific vocabulary, you use the vocabulary you do have. Hunger, fear, love, conflict, birth, death. You turn cycles into characters because characters are easier to remember than numbers. A myth retold for 10,000 years can carry more data than a library that burns. This is not mystical. It's practical. Look at how humans teach children. We don't begin with abstract principles. We begin with stories. We package rules inside narratives because narratives stick. That method is ancient because it works. So if the first civilization wanted to leave guidance, story would be one of the safest vessels. Not because story is vague, but because story is resilient. It adapts to new languages. It survives migration. It can be reshaped without breaking its core. And the core often contains a warning. The world changes. Flood myths, fire myths, world age myths. These can be cultural memories of real events, yes, but they can also be ways of teaching humility. That no society is permanent, that nature is not controllable, that cycles return even when you think you've escaped them. The sky reinforces that lesson every night. It returns, consistent and indifferent, reminding you that your life is brief, but the pattern is long. There's a strange comfort in that. The stars don't care about our calendars, yet our calendars learned from them. The stars don't speak our languages, yet our stories keep translating their motions into meaning. Now think about the curious repetition across cultures. The same constellations and stars appearing again and again as anchors of importance. Orion, Sirius, the Pleiades. We could call it coincidence. We could call it human preference. But we might also call it curriculum. Because those stars are useful. They rise and set in reliable ways. They mark seasons. They can guide travel. They can help you remember where you are in the year when the world below is unstable. If an ancient group wanted to pass down a practical system of timekeeping and navigation, using the brightest sky markers would be the simplest method. You teach the children. When this star appears at dawn, it's time to do this. When this cluster rises after sunset, prepare for that. You embed survival in starlight. The sky becomes an instruction manual that never needs rewriting. And here is where the idea of the first civilization still guiding us becomes oddly plausible. Not as a hidden hand controlling events, but as a set of observational habits so effective they keep re-emerging. The sky rewards attention. Every culture that pays attention will rediscover the same truths. So guidance might not be external at all. Guidance might be the universe being consistent. But there's something else too. The sense that early cultures saw the cosmos as unified. Not as separate realms, earth here, heavens there, but as one system with mirrors and correspondences. Human life reflected celestial order. Architecture mirrored astronomy. Society tried to align with what seemed constant and lawful. Modern science, in its own way, circles back to that old intuition. We now understand that matter and time and gravity are interwoven, that systems influence systems, that nothing exists in isolation. The early worldview that everything is connected sounds mystical until you recognize it as an accurate summary of reality. Perhaps the only difference is vocabulary. Take the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its alignment with true north is nearly perfect. This level of precision implies careful observation of the sky. Some interpretations suggest the layout reflects Orion's belt. Whether or not one accepts every mapping, the broader point remains. Ancient builders often oriented their work to the heavens with deliberate accuracy. They treated the sky like a reference grid. In Mesoamerica, structures track Venus with stunning precision. Venus isn't just a bright star-like object. It follows a cycle that can be measured and predicted. To build a calendar around it requires long-term observation and preservation of data. Not one clever night, many patient generations. Which brings us back to that quiet word, tradition. To notice something like precession, the slow shifting of star positions over thousands of years, you need continuity beyond a single lifetime. The knowledge must be handed down carefully, protected against drift. It must be valued enough to survive. That means there were societies capable of preserving complex observation across centuries. Was that preservation invented anew everywhere? Possibly. Or was there an earlier lineage of skywatchers who seeded the habit widely, teaching the methods that later cultures refined? It's not impossible. A small group of skilled navigators traveling coastlines could spread star knowledge quickly. A handful of teachers who understood calendars could transform any community they joined. Over generations, their origin would blur into legend, but their practices would remain. And even if no such teachers existed, the first civilization could still guide through a different mechanism, through the sky itself as an unchanging tutor. The sky is a lesson that never stops being taught. Every night it repeats. The sun is the most dependable schedule in existence. The moon marks shorter cycles with a clarity your body can feel. Tides respond, seasons answer. The cosmos is a classroom that holds open office hours forever. It is worth noticing how deeply this has shaped our psychology. Humans are not satisfied with randomness. We want order. We want to predict, to plan, to know when the rains will come, when the river will rise, when the cold will bite. The sky was the first tool that made prediction possible. Once you can predict, you can store food. Once you can store, you can settle. Once you settle, you can build. Once you build, you can specialize. Once you specialize, you can refine knowledge. So the sky isn't just symbolism, it's infrastructure. And that means the first civilization, whoever they were, may have been a civilization of observation first, architecture second. Their earliest monuments might not have been walls, but calendars, not kings, but keepers of timing. People who understood that time itself was the most powerful resource. When you think about it that way, many ancient structures become less mysterious and more like practical devices. Shadow casters, light traps, horizon markers, seasonal clocks. They're not primitive temples. They're instruments made from stone because stone survives. They are data storage in geometry. And perhaps that is why we continue the habit in modern form. We build observatories. We launch telescopes into orbit. We send instruments beyond Earth to measure cosmic radiation and planetary atmospheres. We turn the universe into data because our earliest ancestors turned it into story and alignment. We are still doing the same thing, reading the sky for guidance. Even the way we organize our time, the week, the month, the year, is inherited from celestial motion. The month echoes the moon. The year echoes the sun. Our bodies respond to light with hormones and sleep cycles as if we are still living under open skies with no artificial glow. Modern life tries to detach us from the cosmos, but biology refuses. We carry the sky inside us, which means the first civilization never needed to survive physically to keep influencing us. If it taught humanity to use the cosmos as reference, if it embedded celestial attention into culture, then the guidance became self-sustaining. Every culture that followed would find the same sky and learn the same lessons, even if it forgot the original teachers. You could call that inheritance. Or you could call it a collaboration between human attention and a consistent universe. Either way, the result is the same. A continuity of wonder that doesn't break. Tonight, if your window shows even a small slice of darkness, consider the fact that some of the light reaching your eyes began its journey before the pyramids, before the first cities, before anyone wrote down a name for history. You are seeing the past in the present tense. Astronomy is time travel performed with bare eyes. Maybe that's why the sky has always felt like a source of answers. Not because it whispers secrets, but because it is a record that outlasts every civilization. It is the one text that remains readable across extinction and rebirth. And if the first civilization still guides us, perhaps it does so the way a teacher guides a student who will eventually become a teacher too. Not by controlling the lesson, but by pointing toward what is reliable. Look up. Pay attention. The pattern will return. The stars don't hide knowledge. They display it openly. It is each generation's choice whether to interpret the display as chaos or order, as myth or mathematics. The sky teaches both equally well. It always has. As you drift towards sleep, let that be a kind of comfort, that no matter how much changes, the monument overhead remains. The same sky that taught the first builders still teaches us. The same rhythm of light and darkness still shapes our bodies, our stories, our hunger to understand. And perhaps, in the quiet, you can feel the gentle pressure of that inheritance-less, a command than a reminder. We have always been watchers. We have always been students of light. And the lesson, night after night, keeps arriving. If you listen closely to language, really listen, you can hear time inside it. Not the time of clocks, but the slow time of repetition. Syllables worn smooth by centuries of mouths. Meanings shifting like riverbeds. Old metaphors sinking into everyday speech until we forget they were metaphors at all. Language is not just a tool we use, it's a living artifact we inhabit. Unlike stone, which keeps memory by refusing to change, language keeps memory by changing carefully. It adapts, it absorbs, it disguises what it carries, so it can survive migrations, conquests, collapses, and long nights when the old words no longer fit the new world. In that sense, language may be the most resilient archive of all, because it walks around inside us. Imagine the first people who realized sound could be meaning. It's difficult to picture, because we have never lived in a world without shared naming. We can't easily imagine what it would feel like if nothing had a word. If you could not call someone closer with a sound, could not warn, could not comfort, could not point a thought from your mind into another. Somewhere far behind us, a voice became a bridge. Not a poetic bridge, a literal one. Vibration turned into shared reality. A sound repeated until it meant water, another until it meant here, another until it meant danger. Once that happened, something irreversible began. Not just communication, but coordination. Not just coordination, but planning. Not just planning, but tradition. The ability to carry an idea forward without having to rediscover it every time. That is civilization in its earliest form. Memory shared on purpose. And it makes you wonder whether language itself was a threshold reached once and then lost and regained, or whether it was cultivated, refined, encouraged, guided by minds that already understood what it could do. Children learn to speak with astonishing ease. They don't require textbooks to infer grammar. They don't need lectures to pick up rhythm, pattern, structure. They absorb it because the brain arrives prepared for it. The capacity for language is not merely cultural, it's biological. The wiring is there. So the question becomes, how ancient is that wiring? And what has it been shaped by? Some linguists have tried to trace modern tongues backward through families: Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, Sino-Tibetan, Niger-Congo, Austronesian. You can follow threads through sound shifts, shared roots, recurring structures. It's like reconstructing an extinct animal from scattered bones. And beyond that, there are attempts, controversial, careful, incomplete, to imagine even older connections. Proto-languages that might have existed before humans spread widely, before isolation diversified speech into thousands of forms. Whether a single original language existed or not, the impulse to search for it speaks to something deep in us. The feeling that speech is not a random collection of noises, but a lineage. Because language is more than vocabulary. It's architecture of thought. Grammar decides how we connect events. Some languages treat time like a road you move along. Others treat it like a field you stand inside. Some force you to mark whether you witnessed something directly or heard it secondhand. Some insist you name direction as north, south, east, west rather than left, right. These aren't aesthetic differences. They shape cognition. They train attention. Which means, if a first civilization ever existed with a refined way of perceiving reality, its greatest legacy might not have been a tool or a temple. It might have been a structure of attention embedded in language itself, a worldview encoded into the way sentences move. We tend to think of writing as a late invention, but when we encounter the earliest writing systems we have, Sumerian tablets, Egyptian hieroglyphs, early scripts in South Asia, they don't look like scribbles. They look like systems. They arrive already organized, already rule-based, already capable of carrying complex information. That suggests a long, hidden prehistory of oral sophistication. You don't get a mature script without centuries, maybe millennia of thinking in structured language, counting, classifying, categorizing, telling stories with stable forms, repeating them until they become reliable. Writing may not be the birth of language. It may be the moment language acquired a new skin. And when something acquires a new skin, it's usually because the old skin wasn't durable enough. Maybe an early culture watched knowledge die too easily, washed away by floods, scattered by migrations, silenced by loss, and decided to trap meaning in material. Clay tablets, carved stone, knotted cords, ink on papyrus. Every writing system is a reaction to fragility. We must keep this longer than our mouths can keep it. But even before writing, humans preserved vast libraries in sound. Oral cultures can store thousands of lines of genealogies, laws, ecological knowledge, navigation routes, and mythic histories with remarkable accuracy. They use structure to do it: repetition, rhythm, rhyme, parallelism. The body remembers patterns better than it remembers isolated facts. This is where myth becomes something like technology. Not technology of machines, technology of memory. A myth is a compression algorithm. It takes a complex reality, astronomical cycles, ecological rules, social ethics, and stores it as story. The story can be carried without literacy. It can be translated across languages. It can be performed, danced, sung, reenacted, becoming not just information but identity. And identity is hard to erase. This may explain why certain motifs recur globally, even where contact seems unlikely. The world flood, the sky teacher, the trickster who brings fire, the sacred mountain, the underworld, the ladder between realms. We call them archetypes. We say they emerge because human experience is similar. That's true, but archetypes also suggest a deep common reservoir of symbolic structure, a shared language underneath languages. The mind reaches for certain shapes again and again, because those shapes fit the way we perceive existence. Cycles, thresholds, births, deaths, returns. What if the first civilization understood this and deliberately wove its knowledge into archetypes, not to create superstition, but to ensure survival of instruction? Because facts are brittle, symbols bend. A law written as an abstract rule can be forgotten. A law woven into the story of a river spirit that punishes greed can survive for millennia, shaping behavior long after the original reasoning is lost. An ecological rule, don't overhunt during breeding season, can be preserved as taboo, protected by fear and reverence. The community follows it because it feels sacred, not because it was calculated. But the effect is the same. The ecosystem survives and the people survive with it. So perhaps the guidance of the first civilization persists in this form, as emotional and symbolic structures that still steer human behavior even when we no longer recognize their origin. Listen to the way we speak about time. We save it, spend it, waste it. We budget it like money. Those metaphors shape how we live. They aren't neutral. They are cultural choices inherited and reinforced. Now imagine a far older set of metaphors. Time as a circle, as a river, as a breath embedded in early language. If those metaphors dominated for millennia, they would shape how civilizations organize their lives, when to work, when to rest, how to interpret change, how to endure collapse. A culture that understands time as cyclical will rebuild differently than one that believes time is a straight line. And rebuilding is one of humanity's oldest habits. There are other fossils in language two words that persist across families, not because the sound is magical, but because the human mouth tends to make similar easy shapes, and because certain early words stick where later ones drift. Mama appears in some form in many languages because the sound is easy for infants, and because it becomes associated with the first relationship we know. That isn't mystical, it's anatomy. But beyond easy baby sounds, there are deeper patterns of sound symbolism. Many languages use flowing vowels and soft consonants for water words, sharp consonants for hard objects, open vowels for big spaces. The brain associates sound with sensation. That means sound itself can carry meaning, even when words change. The emotional shape of language can endure across translation. It's one reason you can often tell if someone is angry or gentle, even if you don't understand their words. Intonation, rhythm, and stress patterns are ancient. They bypass vocabulary and speak directly to our nervous system. So when we wonder whether the first civilization still speaks, we should consider that the most ancient language might not be any particular tongue. It might be tone, the cadence of comfort, the rhythm of warning, the melody of belonging. These are universal because they are biological. They are older than nations, and they are astonishingly durable. Sometimes, when people hear an ancient language spoken aloud, reconstructed pronunciations of Sumerian or Old Egyptian, for example, they describe a strange feeling of familiarity. Not comprehension, but recognition, as if the mind knows the shape of meaning even when it doesn't know the code. That might be imagination, or it might be the nervous system responding to a cadence that has been part of human communication for a very long time. The body recognizes patterns older than the conscious mind. There's a concept in linguistics called linguistic relativity, the idea that the language you speak influences the way you think. It doesn't mean language traps you, but it does mean language guides attention. If that's true, then language is not merely a tool, it's a steering mechanism. And if the first civilization wanted to guide the future, shaping language would be one of the most effective ways to do it, because language shapes what feels real, what feels important, what feels possible. It's a quiet kind of power, the kind that doesn't require rulers. It requires only repetition. Think about how knowledge survives when writing collapses. Empires fall and libraries burn, but proverbs persist, nursery rhymes persist, ritual phrases persist, songs persist. The simplest forms are the most durable because they are easy to carry and hard to break. We still do this today without realizing it. Advertisements use rhyme and repetition because it works. Children learn through melody because melody sticks. Political slogans succeed not because they are nuanced, but because they are rhythmic. Pattern is memory's favorite shape. This is why in many early societies, music and language were not separate. Stories were sung. Laws were recited in verse. Genealogies were chanted. This wasn't decoration. It was storage. A sung memory lasts longer than a spoken one. Rhythm is scaffolding for information. So perhaps the oldest libraries were not buildings at all. They were human throats around a fire, weaving knowledge into sound so it could travel through time. If the first civilization existed, and if it wanted to survive beyond catastrophe, this would have been one of its safest strategies. Encode essential knowledge in forms that can be remembered without paper. Teach people to carry truth in song. And if you listen to humanity closely, you can still hear the echoes of that strategy. In lullabies, in hymns, in chants at stadiums, in the way we instinctively use rhythm when we want a message to spread. We have always been an oral species, even when we pretend we aren't. There's another strange possibility that hovers at the edge of this, that the structure of thought itself, the categories we take for granted, may be inherited not only through biology, but through the deep history of language. Almost every culture distinguishes things from actions, nouns and verbs. Almost every culture has ways to express negation, causation, possibility. These may reflect universal brain structure, but universal structures have histories. They emerge, stabilize, and persist. If an early civilization refined these structures, if it developed ways of thinking that were especially effective for survival and coordination, those structures would spread and endure, shaping descendants even after the original culture vanished. In that sense, the first civilization's legacy might be invisible because it's everywhere. It's inside the basic way we connect ideas. It's in the grammar of cause and effect we use to build science. It's in the metaphors we use to build meaning. If you want a civilization to last without monuments, you make its worldview contagious. You make it portable. You embed it in how people think. And that brings us back to the quiet feeling we started with, that some discoveries feel like remembering. Because if the architecture of thought is inherited, then new ideas may not be built from scratch. They may be assembled from old cognitive parts that have been waiting. When the world reaches the right conditions, the same structures produce the same insights again. That's not mysticism. That's continuity. The first civilization doesn't need to whisper in our ears. It might be speaking in our syntax. It might be guiding us in the way we ask questions, the way we organize reality, the way we expect patterns to exist. The expectation of order is not guaranteed by nature. It is a choice the mind makes. And humanity makes it again and again, as if taught. As the night holds you quiet, steady notice how often your mind returns to story when it seeks truth. Notice how you remember through rhythm. Notice how comfort arrives in familiar phrases even when you don't know why. Language is the longest unbroken chain we have. Every sentence is a handoff. Every word is a fossil that still breathes. And if the first civilization still guides us, perhaps this is one of its deepest victories, that we are still speaking, still teaching, still carrying meaning forward through air, turning thought into vibration, and vibration into memory, continuing a conversation that began before anyone knew how to count the years. Everywhere you look, the traces of human hands remain. Not just the obvious ones, buildings, roads, machines, but the subtler signatures. A groove worn into a stone step by centuries of feet. The polished edge of a tool handled so often it learned the shape of a palm. The smoothness of a wooden rail where countless fingers rested without thinking. Civilization is a story told through touch. We talk about ideas as if they float above the body, but nothing human becomes real until it passes through hands. Every invention begins as a thought, yes, but it becomes civilization only when someone repeats the motion until it works. The story of humanity is written not only in minds, but in muscle memory, in calluses, in the quiet confidence of practiced gestures. If the first civilization survived in any form, I sometimes suspect it survived here in embodied knowledge. In skills passed hand to hand so reliably they didn't need words. In movements that became culture the way walking becomes second nature. Anthropologists have a name for this. Embodied knowledge, learning that lives in the body rather than in explicit explanation. You can describe a technique 100 times and still not understand it until your hands do it. A potter's pressure on clay, a weaver's tension in thread, a carpenter's sense of grain, a mason's eye for level. These are languages of their own, and they are astonishingly resilient because they are taught through demonstration, not doctrine. A gesture can survive where a text cannot. Think of the cave handprints, those ancient palms pressed against stone, surrounded by pigment blown through a mouth. Positive prints and negative silhouettes. The simplest possible signature. I was here. Not a name, not a date, just presence. And they appear everywhere. Europe, Indonesia, Australia, the Americas. Different peoples, different ages, the same instinct. The hand offered to the wall as if to say, remember the shape of me. It's tempting to treat that as art, as ritual, as a moment of play. But it's also something more practical, a declaration that identity can outlast the body when it is anchored in matter. The same impulse that drives gravestones, the same impulse that drives archives, the same impulse that drives us to write our names on the inside cover of a book. The first civilization, if it existed, may have understood this impulse and amplified it, turning hands into instruments of continuity. Look at tools, and you can see the same story. Continuity disguised as progress. The first blades, the first scrapers, the first needles. These forms appear early and persist. Modern versions are refined, not reinvented. A knife is still a knife because a cutting edge is a universal solution. A hammer is still a hammer because leverage is a universal principle. When you hold a simple stone tool in a museum, the distance between you and its maker shrinks to almost nothing. Your hand recognizes the logic instantly. You don't need an instruction manual. Your fingers understand. That is what makes tools so haunting. They are readable across time. And the way tools evolve is rarely a smooth upward curve. Progress happens in bursts and pauses. Techniques appear, disappear, and reappear elsewhere. Sometimes a method emerges that seems ahead of its time, then vanishes from the record, only to be discovered again centuries later. Concrete is one example. Certain forms of advanced metallurgy are another. There are technologies that flare up like sparks in the dark, visible for a moment, then gone. We often explain this as independent invention or lost knowledge, and those are reasonable explanations. But the pattern itself invites a gentler thought, that humanity keeps remembering fragments of a manual it once held more completely. Not because there's a secret book hidden under the earth, but because methods can survive collapse better than cities can. A displaced craftsperson can carry technique in their hands. A refugee can carry an entire engineering philosophy without carrying a single artifact. When civilizations fall, the body becomes the archive. Consider craftsmanship in early societies. In many cultures, making was not just labor. It was sacred. Not in the sense of supernatural, but in the sense of being tied to order. Building a home, carving a vessel, shaping a tool. These were acts that aligned human intention with material reality. They were ways of participating in the world rather than merely extracting from it. You can see echoes of this mindset across time. Egyptian artisans treated proportion as cosmic harmony. Greek builders pursued symmetry as if it were moral. Japanese carpenters speak of cooperating with wood rather than forcing it. Indigenous craft traditions often treat materials as relational stone, wood, clay, as partners, not inert resources. This could be superstition, or it could be deep empirical respect disguised as reverence. When you treat material as alive with properties, grain, fracture lines, moisture, temperature, you build better. You make things that last. A builder who listens to stone is a builder who notices physics. The language differs, the competence remains. If the first civilization taught anything enduring, it may have taught this, that nature is not a pile of dead stuff. It is a system of behaviors, and materials behave predictably if you pay attention. That is the earliest science, and it moves through hands. There's a reason certain shapes appear again and again in human construction. Triangles for strength, arches for load distribution, circles for enclosure and stability. Even without formal mathematics, the body can learn these patterns through trial, observation, and imitation. Once learned, they become tradition. A child stacking blocks tends to discover stability, quickly wide bases, balanced centers, symmetrical placement. They don't need to know the word center of mass to behave as if they do. The body learns rules and remembers them. Now widen that image. Generations stacking stone, learning what holds, teaching by demonstration. Over centuries, the community becomes a library of structural wisdom. Even if the original reasoning fades, the method persists. This may be why so many early architectures feel remembered. They appear not as clumsy experiments, but as competent forms. Because the competence was carried by hands that already knew what to do. Agriculture, often treated as the great beginning of civilization, may have spread the same way. Planting a seed and expecting a future harvest is a profound act of trust in cycles. It requires patience, foresight, and a willingness to delay gratification. It requires you to believe the world will still be there later, and that you will too. That belief is not trivial. It is a psychological technology, and the shift to farming appears in multiple regions in a relatively narrow window of time. Southwest Asia, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, parts of Africa. Some of this can be explained by climate stabilization after the Ice Age, some by independent experimentation. But the near simultaneity still raises a quiet question. Did ideas travel faster than we assume? Did small groups carry methods and seeds and seasonal knowledge along coastlines and trade routes, seeding agriculture like sparks in dry grass? If survivors of earlier catastrophes existed, people with partial knowledge of cultivation, storage, calendrics, they could have accelerated the transition dramatically. To communities living in a more immediate mode, such knowledge would look miraculous. Not because it was supernatural, but because it was unfamiliar. Over time, the ones who taught us to plant become mythic figures, culture heroes, gods of grain, visitors from the sea. Their names differ, but their function repeats. Again and again, the story says, someone came, and we learned to live differently. Whether those someones were real outsiders or simply the first innovators within each region, the pattern still teaches us something. Knowledge is most powerful when it becomes practice. Practice is most durable when it is embodied. And embodied knowledge survives, even when written history fails. Even today, you can see how deep skill transcends era. A potter from 5,000 years ago could sit at a modern wheel and recognize the motion immediately. The clay behaves the same. The hands respond the same. A weaver from a lost village could understand the logic of a loom without needing the language of its parts. This is one of the reasons museums feel strange when you look closely. Not because the past is alien, but because it isn't. The objects are different in style, but the solutions are familiar. Contain water, cut meat, store grain, protect warmth, mark time, honor dead, speak across absence. We are still solving the same problems. We are still using variations of the same gestures. And our modern technology, for all its complexity, still carries the fingerprint of hands. Even the word digital comes from digit finger. We build with algorithms now, yes, but we still build. We still translate intention into structure. Code is just another kind of craft, a different medium for the same impulse. To shape reality so it behaves. When you type or swipe or sketch on a screen, you're performing the descendant of the same motion that once carved a line into bone or pressed pigment around a hand on stone. The material changed. The gesture endured. If the first civilization still guides us, perhaps it does so through this continuity of making, through the stubborn human habit of turning thought into form, through the way our hands keep seeking patterns that work. Balance, symmetry, leverage, rhythm. And maybe that's why the urge to create feels so essential. It isn't optional for us. It's not a hobby humanity picked up late. It's a lineage, because creation is how memory becomes external. Creation is how a mind says, this mattered enough to preserve. When you build something, even something small, you are participating in the oldest conversation there is. The conversation between intention and matter. The first civilization may have begun that conversation at a higher pitch than we remember, but we have never stopped speaking it. So take a moment tonight and look at your own hands. Not dramatically, just quietly. Notice the lines, the small scars, the way your fingers know how to do things your conscious mind couldn't explain step by step. Tie, twist, grip, balance, soothe. Your hands are ancient technology. They are also inheritance. And if guidance exists, it may be here in the muscle memory that nudges you to keep building, keep learning, keep refining the world into something that can carry meaning forward. Because even when civilizations collapse, hands remain. Hands carry fire. Hands carry seeds. Hands carry stories. Hands rebuild. Beneath your feet, the world is not quiet. It only pretends to be. A handful of soil holds more lives than a city skyline suggests. Microbes, fungi, roots, insects, an entire metropolis of small beings moving through dark corridors, trading nutrients, breaking down what was, assembling what will be. If you could translate their chemistry into sound, you might hear something like a low, constant hum. The earth speaking to itself in a language older than breath. We tend to imagine civilization as something that sits on top of the planet, a layer of stone and steel and asphalt. But the deeper truth is the opposite. Civilization is rooted. It is fed by systems beneath it, and those systems remember more than we can see. Tonight, let's hold a different possibility. What if the first civilization didn't leave its most enduring traces in pyramids or pillars, but in soil? Not as a hidden treasure, but as influence. Soil is not just dirt. It is the planet's living skin. It stores water, holds minerals, shelters seeds, digests the dead, and feeds the future. It is where past becomes potential. In that sense, soil is an archive that doesn't keep records in objects, but in chemistry and pattern. Modern science already knows this in practical ways. Archaeologists read human history through changes in soil, elevated phosphates where people lived, charcoal layers where fires burned, pollen deposits that reveal what was growing, microscopic fragments that tell of animals and crops. Even when buildings are gone, the ground keeps the signature of habitation, the earth forgets slowly, and soil is one of its best memories. There's a strange comfort in realizing that time moves vertically as much as it moves forward. We treat history like a line you walk along, but the planet records it as depth. The deeper you dig, the older the story. Layers like pages pressed together. Ash from eruptions, silt from floods, dust from droughts, seeds from harvests, bones from meals, fragments of pottery, tiny splinters of charcoal that once were warmth. If a civilization vanished long ago, its cities might crumble beyond recognition, but the soil beneath them would still carry the imprint. Altered nutrient profiles, disturbed sediment patterns, imported plant species taking root, microbial communities shaped by human activity. Even the absence of something can be recorded. A forest cleared leaves a different soil signature than a forest never touched. A river diverted changes the distribution of silt and minerals downstream for millennia. A terrace built on a mountain slope alters erosion in ways that still guide water long after the people are gone. Influence can outlast architecture because influence becomes environment. Consider the hidden networks of fungi, the mycorrhizal webs that link plant roots underground. Scientists sometimes call it the wood wide web, a phrase that's playful but not wrong. Through these networks, trees exchange nutrients, share chemical warnings, and redistribute resources. Older trees can support younger ones. Plants can signal danger, prompting neighbors to adjust their defenses. It's decentralized intelligence, slow, distributed, cooperative. A forest is not a collection of individuals. It's a community with infrastructure. Now imagine early humans noticing this, not with microscopes, but with patience, watching which plants thrive together, observing how a grove recovered after fire, learning that certain mushrooms appeared near certain trees and that the soil behaved differently where fungal mats thickened. Over generations, observation becomes wisdom. The land is not passive. The land responds. The land remembers. Many traditional cultures already speak this way. They describe the ground as sacred, not because it is abstractly holy, but because it is alive with relationship. Farmers offer respect before planting. Communities follow taboos about where to cut, where to hunt, when to burn. From a modern lens, it can look like superstition, but it is often ecology encoded into ritual systems management carried through reverence. A taboo can protect an ecosystem more effectively than a law can because it sits in the nervous system. It shapes behavior without requiring enforcement. It becomes automatic. If the first civilization understood this power, how belief can preserve behavior, then perhaps their most durable technology was not stone or metal, but culture as ecological engineering. Not domination of nature, but partnership with it. Imagine a civilization that learned to design landscapes the way we design machines, except their machines were living systems. Orchards that sustained themselves, terraces that distributed water, wetlands engineered to filter, forests managed to resist fire. The structures would not look like monuments. They would look like nature functioning beautifully. And if such a civilization collapsed, its legacy would not necessarily be ruins. It would be ecosystems still shaped by ancient design. We see hints of this in the real world. Ancient terrace agriculture in the Andes continues to regulate water flow and prevent erosion centuries after it was built. In some places, abandoned terraces still guide rainfall like quiet hands, distributing nutrients, holding soil in place, allowing biodiversity to return without chaos. In parts of Southeast Asia, old rice terraces shape microclimates that persist even when the fields are no longer actively farmed. In the Amazon, there are patches of terra preta, rich, dark soil believed to be partly human-made, created through charcoal and organic matter management. These soils remain fertile for centuries, an enduring human fingerprint that acts like a gift to the future. This is what I mean by soil remembering. The ground keeps the pattern and keeps performing it. If you want something to last, you don't only build strong, you build self-renewing. Stone endures, but it does not heal. Soil does. And beneath soil, in the microbial world, memory becomes even stranger. Microbial communities adapt to conditions rapidly. They shift in response to nutrients, moisture, disturbance, toxins. Once altered, they can remain altered, creating a kind of biological inertia. The land becomes predisposed towards certain futures. This means human activity can write long-term tendencies into ecosystems. Plant a certain crop repeatedly, and the soil's microbial balance changes. Clear a forest, and the nutrient cycle shifts. Introduce a new plant, and the entire network reorganizes around it. So the question becomes, what if an ancient civilization won, more attentive, perhaps more long-term in its planning-shaped land, deliberately to carry forward principles? Not messages carved in stone, but conditions designed to teach. A well-designed irrigation system teaches water where to go. A terrace teaches rain how to behave. A managed forest teaches fire how to move. A sacred grove teaches people where not to cut. These are lessons the landscape repeats. They don't require writing. They don't require memory in the human sense. They require only that the system continues. In that way, guidance can be embedded in terrain. The earth becomes the manual. There's another layer of this. Elements cycle endlessly. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus atoms move through plants, animals, soil, air, and water in loops that never truly stop. The molecule you exhale tonight will be inhaled by something else. The calcium in your bones may once have been coral. The iron in your blood may have been ancient rock. The planet is a recycler of matter and a recycler of consequence. Nothing disappears. It becomes something else. When ancient cultures buried their dead, many believed they were returning them to the land as nourishment. That belief was not wrong. It was biogeochemistry expressed as ritual. The dead feed the soil. The soil feeds the living. In that sense, burial is participation in the archive, placing memory back into the system that sustains it. If a first civilization wanted to ensure continuity, it could have built its philosophy around this truth, that permanence is not resisting change, but cooperating with transformation. The soil teaches this every season. Leaves fall, rot, feed roots, become new leaves. A field left alone becomes meadow, then forest. The land remembers how to heal. We often ask, why do humans keep rebuilding? Perhaps because we are imitating the soil. We break down. We reassemble. We cycle. Modern science has begun to uncover forms of intelligence in nature that sound almost like metaphor until you see the data. Slime molds can solve mazes by finding efficient routes to food. Plants alter their growth in response to neighbors and obstacles. Microbes coordinate behavior through chemical signals. None of this requires a brain. It requires networks and feedback. Intelligence, it seems, can be distributed. If intelligence can be distributed, then influence can be distributed too preserved, not in a single artifact, but in systems that self-correct and self-maintain. This is what makes the idea of an integrated, vanished yet present first civilization feel less impossible. If a culture reached a level of ecological sophistication, its legacy would be the persistence of balance. And balance is easy to mistake for just nature. We might not recognize the design because the design succeeded. A perfect technology disappears into normality. Even in our own time, we are moving toward technologies that hide. Algorithms quietly managing grids, sensors monitoring soil moisture, automation regulating flows. The more advanced the system, the less visible the machinery. So imagine a civilization that learned to build with living systems as their medium. Their monuments would not be towers. They would be watersheds that still function, forests that still resist collapse, soils that remain fertile, traditions that protect biodiversity, influence that persists because it has become part of the Earth's operating habits. You can see how this might happen, even without grand intention. Simply by building repeatedly in a way that respects long-term cycles, the land responds. The best practices persist. The unsuccessful ones fade. Over centuries, the landscape becomes a fossil of decisions. That fossil can guide the future. Even now, we are guided by ancient soils. Our agriculture depends on patterns discovered long before writing. Composting, crop rotation, fallowing, seed selection, irrigation. We treat these as techniques, but they are really agreements with the living earth. They work because they align with how soil wants to behave. When we ignore that, soil breaks. It erodes, loses structure, loses life. When we remember the rhythm, soil recovers. The lesson is ongoing. The ground is always teaching. So perhaps the first civilization's guidance is not a message hidden in ruins. It is the quiet insistence of the earth. Work with me, not against me. The watchers beneath our feet microbes, fungi, roots, are patient. They rebuild after us. They absorb our ruins and turn them into future fertility. They do not worship our monuments. They digest them. They don't preserve our cities. They compost them. And in that composting, memory continues. Next time you walk across a field or through a park, consider what lies beneath the surface. Countless generations layered into soil, mixed and remixed. Tiny particles of charcoal from ancient fires. Pollen from plants that no longer grow there. Microbial lineages that adapted to humans living nearby long ago. The ground beneath you is a biography written in chemistry. Somewhere under the topsoil, there may be traces of the first civilization not as relics to display, but as altered ecosystems still behaving in the shapes they introduced. If they still guide us, it might be through the land itself, through terraces that hold, through soils that feed, through forests that warn, through networks that cooperate. Guidance as conditions, not commands. And if we listen quietly, with the kind of attention the night encourages, we might begin to recognize that civilization has always been a collaboration between human intention and the living earth. The soil is not merely where history is buried. It is where history becomes future. Civilizations move like living things. They gather themselves, grow dense with purpose, expand their reach, then falter, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, and return to the ground in one way or another. We like to imagine human history as a staircase, one step higher, always upward. But the earth doesn't do staircases. The earth does seasons. The earth does tides. The earth does pulses. And so do we. If you step back far enough past borders, past dynasties, past the familiar names, you can see the rhythm. Cities rise like inhalations, bright, crowded, ambitious. Then the exhale. Silence. Abandonment. The slow softening of stone. Fields flourish. Then salt, then green again. Languages diverge, merge, disappear. The pattern is not neat, but it is familiar. It repeats with the calm insistence of biology. Archaeologists find this rhythm embedded in the ground itself. One occupation layer, then another, stacked like rings in a tree. A new city built atop an older one, using its rubble as foundation. Streets traced along ancient paths because the terrain still prefers them. Wells dug in the same places because water still gathers there. Temples rebuilt on the same footprint because memory lingers in landscape even when names are lost. Sometimes the new builders don't even know they are repeating. They think they are beginning. But the land remembers, and it nudges the beginning into the grooves of what came before. This is one reason first civilization is such a slippery phrase. Because in many places, civilization looks less like a birth and more like a recurrence. A resurfacing, a reassembly. The pieces shift, but the urge returns, and it raises a gentle, unsettling thought. What if collapse is not the opposite of civilization, but part of its operating cycle? We use harsh words, decline, dark age, failure as if anything that ends must have been broken. But nature doesn't treat endings as moral. Forests burn and return. Rivers flood and retreat. Species vanish and give rise to new ones. Systems reset. A field left fallow is not dead. It is resting. A civilization that disperses might not be erased. It might be redistributed. Its people carrying skills into new places, its ideas seeding new cultures, its stories thickening into myth. In that sense, collapse can be a form of transmission. Knowledge scattered wider than it could have been contained. The first civilization, if it existed, may have understood this rhythm well enough to stop resisting it. Perhaps they realized you cannot make any one society permanent, but you can make the pattern permanent. You can build a pulse that survives. And once a pulse exists, it doesn't need constant control. It sustains itself through repetition, like breath, like heartbeat, like the turning of seasons. You can see this rhythm even in the smaller structures of human life: work and rest, feast and famine, expansion and consolidation. Cultures across time formalize these oscillations in ritual. Harvest festivals followed by winter stillness, Sabbaths embedded in weeks, fasting seasons followed by celebration. These aren't random. They are human life syncing itself to cycles larger than individual desire. Our calendars are the skeleton of that rhythm: the year's arc, the week's repetition, the day's inhale and exhale. And beneath these human rhythms are the cosmic ones: Earth's rotation, the moon's orbit, the planet's tilt. We didn't invent these cycles, we responded to them. We built civilization inside them the way a bird builds a nest inside the constraints of gravity and wind. This is why ancient architectures often feel like time machines. They are not only buildings, they are rhythm-made stone. Solstice corridors, equinox shadows, horizon markers. They embed cyclical time into physical space, ensuring that even if everything else changes, the return of light will keep teaching the same lesson. Return, repeat, begin again. Historians sometimes speak of deep time currents beneath the surface noise of events. Wars and rulers are splashes on top. Underneath, there are long waves, demographic shifts, climate cycles, resource flows that shape civilizations more powerfully than individual decisions. It's humbling. It suggests we are less in charge than we feel, but it also suggests continuity. A wave doesn't vanish when it breaks. It becomes another motion. Some modern researchers try to model these civilizational cycles mathematically. Cooperation rising, then competition, then collapse, then cooperation again. Too much order leads to stagnation. Too much chaos leads to fracture. Adaptation thrives at the edge, in the oscillation between stability and disruption. Life itself depends on this. The heart is not a steady tone. It is alternating tension and release. The lungs do not hold one breath, they move. The nervous system is built on pulses. So perhaps civilization is not meant to be a permanent structure. Perhaps it is meant to be a process. If that's true, then the fear of collapse, so baked into modern thinking, might be a misunderstanding. Not that suffering is good, not that destruction is desirable, but that the rhythm includes phases we would rather not name. The winter of a culture can be brutal, but winter also carries seeds. It quiets the noise long enough for new forms to take root. Sometimes knowledge hibernates. It survives in monasteries, in families, in crafts, in oral traditions, in marginal places where the big systems forget to look. Then conditions change, and the knowledge returns not as a museum piece, but as a tool needed again. This is one reason history contains so many rediscoveries. Ancient texts resurfacing, lost techniques revived, old philosophies returning in new language, wind power, once old, now new again, herbal medicine, once dismissed, now studied with respect. Ideas that look modern until you recognize they are simply ancient patterns expressed with updated tools. It's as if humanity keeps waking up with fragments of the same dream, and the tempo of these cycles seems to be accelerating. Tens of thousands of years from stone to metal, a few thousand from metal to machines, a few hundred from machines to information, a few decades from information to something that begins to look like distributed intelligence. The intervals shrink, the heartbeat quickens. That acceleration can feel like progress, and it is, but it can also feel like something else, like a system approaching a threshold, a phase change, a new rhythm. The first civilization, if it seeded an enduring pulse, may have designed it to adapt. Each cycle carrying more complexity than the last, each return not identical but evolved. A spiral, not a circle. Spirals are important. They're one of the shapes the universe loves. Galaxies, shells, storms, plant growth. The spiral repeats because it's efficient. It allows return without stagnation. You revisit the same angle, but at a new distance. Civilization might be a spiral too. We repeat themes: agriculture, cities, trade, war, art, science. But each repetition occurs with slightly different tools, slightly different awareness. We don't go back to the exact same point. We go back around, changed. If the first civilization left guidance, perhaps the guidance wasn't build this or worship that. Perhaps it was follow the spiral. Let the cycle return, but carry something forward each time. Keep the torch alive even when the wind changes. This is one of the few ways a civilization can truly endure. Not by freezing itself, but by teaching its descendants how to rebuild. And the evidence that we have learned this lesson is everywhere. We preserve seeds in vaults because we know crops can fail. We archive data redundantly because we know systems can collapse. We distribute knowledge globally because we know local memory can be lost. We talk about resilience now as a virtue because we are beginning again to recognize the rhythm. The first civilization, perhaps, already knew that resilience is not a trait. It is a strategy. It is civilization's immune system. There's a quiet comfort in viewing history this way, not because it makes suffering acceptable, but because it makes renewal plausible. If collapse is part of the pulse, then so is rebuilding. If winter comes, spring also comes, not as reward, but as function. The earth itself demonstrates this relentlessly. After mass extinctions, life diversifies. After ice ages, forests spread. After eruptions, soil eventually becomes rich. Even deserts can bloom after rare rains. The planet does not cling to one form, it returns to balance through transformation. If civilization is a planetary process, a phase of Earth learning to think through beings that can reflect, then our cycles might mirror the planet's cycles. Not separate, but nested. Human rise and fall as a smaller heartbeat inside Earth's vast one. And maybe that's the point. The first civilization might have understood that to endure, you must harmonize with the larger rhythm. You cannot outmuscle the planet. You can only learn its timing. Sometimes, you can feel civilization's pulse in modern life. A city at night lights, blinking like synapses, traffic flowing like blood, power grids humming. During the day, the pulse intensifies, faster, louder. At night, it softens, but it doesn't stop. Servers continue. Water moves through pipes. Trains cut through darkness. Even sleeping cities breathe. Civilization never truly sleeps. It shifts tempos. So maybe the question isn't whether the first civilization vanished. Maybe the question is whether it ever stopped being expressed. If their guidance was rhythmic, if it was encoded in the very tendency of human systems to oscillate, adapt, and rebuild, then their legacy is still functioning right now. Every time a society collapses and knowledge survives in pockets, that's the pulse protecting itself. Every time a new generation rebuilds with a little more awareness, that's the spiral turning. Every time we sense, collectively, that something must change. Our relationship to the planet, to each other, that may be the rhythm calling us toward the next phase. And perhaps that is the oldest instruction of all. Don't try to escape the cycle. Learn to move with it. As the night holds steady around you, listen for that pulse, not in the sense of hearing an actual sound, but in noticing the alternation that lives in everything. Breath in, breath out. Light, dark. Build, rest. Remember, forget, remember again. Nothing is lost. It is only transformed. And everything that was, in some form, returns. Every idea begins as a whisper. Not a proclamation, not a clean blueprint unrolled on a table, more like a soft pressure at the edge of thought, the kind that makes you pause in the middle of a task because something inside you has shifted, and you don't know why yet. A painter wakes with an image that feels borrowed. A scientist stares at a problem for days. Then the answer arrives while washing dishes. A musician hears a melody, as if the air itself has been rehearsing it without them. We call these moments inspiration, intuition, genius. But there's another way to hold them, as echoes. As if the human mind sometimes receives rather than invents. As if it is tuned occasionally to a frequency older than personal memory. If the first civilization still guides us, perhaps its guidance doesn't come as a message carved in stone, but as a tendency in thought, a way of arriving at truth that feels like remembering. Because true insight has a distinctive texture. It doesn't feel like assembling. It feels like recognizing. Modern culture likes to celebrate the lone inventor, the solitary mind pulling miracles out of nothing. Yet when you look closely at how discovery actually happens, the story changes. Breakthroughs often appear in clusters, in multiple places, in multiple minds, almost simultaneously. People who have never met reaching the same conclusion, as if the idea itself has ripened, and the world is ready to harvest it. There's a name for this: multiple discovery. Calculus appearing in more than one mind. The telephone developed by different inventors, evolution articulated by separate naturalists. Even in medicine, physics, engineering ideas surfacing at the same time like mushrooms after rain. We can explain this rationally. Similar conditions, shared prior knowledge, the same problems pressing on different people. All true, but the pattern still feels uncanny when you sit with it, because it suggests that human thought is not merely private. It moves through a shared environment of ideas the way weather moves through landscapes. When conditions align, the same storm forms. If the first civilization left a legacy, perhaps it functions like that, not as a secret, but as a set of foundational patterns that keep resurfacing when humanity reaches certain thresholds. Some ancient cultures spoke openly of inspiration as something external. The Greeks had muses, not metaphors, but presences. The idea that art and insight were gifts, not property. In India, wisdom was linked to Saraswati, a river of knowledge. Many indigenous traditions treat creativity as borrowing from nature, from ancestors, from the spirit of place. The artist is a channel, not an owner. Modern minds often shrug at this. We prefer neurological explanations, the unconscious, associative networks, pattern recognition. But the mechanism doesn't erase the mystery. Why does the unconscious deliver answers with the feeling of certainty? Why do some insights arrive complete, as if retrieved from storage rather than built? Neuroscience has an interesting detail here. Moments of insight often light up brain regions associated with memory retrieval as much as, or more than, step-by-step problem solving. The brain treats discovery like recall. The circuitry of remembering and finding overlaps, which raises a gentle possibility. Perhaps the sensation of, "I've seen this before," is not merely metaphorical. Perhaps new knowledge is often old structure seen in new context. Perhaps humanity is rediscovering the underlying order of reality again and again, each time with a slightly different language. And perhaps the first civilization, if it was a civilization of observation, was the first to map some of those structures, leaving them embedded in myth, architecture, habit, and cognition. When we reach the right intellectual climate, the old map becomes legible again, not as a scroll, but as a hunch. Dreams complicate this further. Dreams are the oldest theater we have, older than writing, older than cities. For most of human history, dreams were treated as messages, from gods, from ancestors, from the land itself. Even now, despite our rational habits, dreams retain an authority that feels disproportionate to their strangeness. We wake with emotions that outlast the images. We feel instructed, haunted, comforted, warned. Science offers explanations, memory consolidation, emotional processing, neural housekeeping. Reasonable. But it still doesn't capture how often dreams deliver solutions. How many inventors, artists, and mathematicians have described dream-born clarity? Mendeleev's periodic table, stories of melodies appearing complete, problems untangling themselves in sleep. What if dreams are sometimes the mind dipping into a deeper reservoir of pattern? A layer of cognition that doesn't speak in words but in symbols, movement, feeling. A place where the oldest human templates still live. Psychology has a term for shared symbolic patterns. Archetypes, images that recur across cultures, water as transformation, stairs as transition, snakes as fear or knowledge, thresholds as change. Carl Jung called the source of these patterns the collective unconscious, a shared layer of mind shaped by the experiences of humanity as a whole. You don't have to accept Jung's entire framework to notice the phenomenon. We dream in similar languages. Even when our cultures differ, our symbols rhyme. The mind reaches for the same shapes when it tries to speak to itself. And archetypes, like myths, are memory tech. They preserve patterns in a form that can survive forgetting. This is why art across millennia keeps returning to the same motifs: spirals, eyes, trees, ladders, suns, rivers, labyrinths. You find them carved into Neolithic stones, painted in medieval manuscripts, printed on modern posters, woven into digital design. The tools change, the motifs persist, It's as if the human imagination has a set of foundational shapes it cannot stop drawing. We call it aesthetics, but it may be inheritance. If the first civilization encoded principles into symbols rather than text into forms that the unconscious could carry, then those symbols could resurface without direct transmission. A person in one era draws a spiral because it feels right, not knowing that a spiral was once used to represent time, water, growth, or the path of stars. The artist believes they are creating. In a deeper sense, they are participating in a long chain of recollection. And this chain doesn't only exist in art, it exists in science too. Many breakthroughs begin as if feeling a hunch that contradicts available evidence but insists anyway. Einstein spoke of thought experiments guided by imagination. Tesla described visualizing machines in full detail before building them, as if he were inspecting something already real. Some inventors report that solutions arrive with an emotional signature: relief, certainty, quiet recognition. We treat emotion as separate from reason, but in the mind, emotion often acts like a compass. It signals coherence. It signals that disparate pieces have clicked into a stable pattern. That click can feel like being guided, not by an external being, but by an internal alignment with reality's structure. Perhaps the first civilization's greatest contribution was not information but method, the habit of trusting pattern recognition, the practice of deep observation, the discipline of waiting for coherence rather than forcing it. Because forcing produces noise, observing produces signal. This idea becomes even more interesting when we look at collective shifts in society, moments when entire populations seem to feel the same change coming. A mood spreads, a dissatisfaction thickens, a hunger for a new ethic rises. Historians point to economics, politics, resources, and those matter. But beneath them, there's often something harder to quantify: timing. The sense that the time has come. Civilization has moods the way oceans have tides. An idea that once seemed impossible becomes obvious in a single generation. Cooperation becomes necessary. A new kind of awareness takes hold, not because everyone suddenly became smarter, but because the network of human thought reached a threshold. The conditions changed, and the same seed ideas that had been dormant begin to sprout. If the first civilization left seeds, this is how they would behave. Seeds don't announce themselves. They wait for water. They wait for warmth. They wait for the season that makes them viable. Perhaps certain truths about interdependence, about living within cycles, about respecting the planet's limits, are seeds that were planted long ago and keep reappearing when human systems drift too far from balance. The guidance would not be a voice. It would be a correction, a return of insight prompted by necessity. You can see this in our modern relationship with Earth. For centuries, many societies acted as if nature were infinite and separate. Now we are rediscovering urgently that the planet is a system of feedback, that extraction has consequences, that health is ecological, that survival depends on cooperation not only with each other, but with the soil, the air, the water. It feels like progress. It might also be remembering. And here, too, the pattern repeats. Independent minds arriving at the same conclusions. Sustainable agriculture being rediscovered. Indigenous ecological knowledge being validated by science. Systems thinking reappearing in fields from biology to economics to technology. A return to the notion that everything is connected, an ancient intuition dressed in modern vocabulary. Sometimes I think the first civilization is most present in this precise moment. The moment when humanity begins, again, to notice that it cannot separate itself from the world that makes it. If guidance exists, it might not come in the form of new facts. It might come as a change in attention, a shift in what we value, toward resilience, toward balance, toward long-term thinking, toward designing systems that renew themselves rather than burn out. That would be a very first civilization kind of lesson, wouldn't it? And perhaps the whispers we sometimes hear, those hunches, those sudden recognitions, those creative floods are simply the mind aligning with deep patterns that were always there. The universe doesn't hide its structure. It repeats it at every scale. Spirals and shells and galaxies, networks and roots and brains, cycles and seasons and civilizations. When the mind notices repetition, it learns. When a culture notices repetition, it becomes wise. If the first civilization still guides us, perhaps it guides us the way gravity guides a river. Not by issuing commands, but by making certain paths more coherent than others. The path of balance feels right. The path of extraction feels wrong. The mind senses the difference even before it can explain it. That is the quiet nature of a whisper. It doesn't force, it invites. So tonight, if you find your thoughts drifting toward old questions, toward patterns you can't quite name, don't rush to pin them down. Let them hover. Let them shape themselves. Sometimes, understanding arrives in the same way dawn arrives, gradually, inevitably, without drama. You are not alone in that process. Humanity is a network of listeners, and it has been listening for a very long time. Maybe what we call genius is simply someone hearing the ancient frequency a little more clearly. Maybe what we call discovery is memory becoming visible again. And maybe the first civilization, wherever it went, never needed to shout. It only needed to remain consistent in the patterns it left behind, patterns the mind cannot help but recognize, sooner or later, when it grows quiet enough to hear. Memory doesn't begin and end with the mind. That sounds like poetry until you remember what a body is. A living library of instructions, copied and corrected across unimaginable time. Every cell in you carries molecules that have been passing messages forward since life learned to persist. And persistence, at its core, is remembrance. Not in the sense of nostalgia, but in the sense of knowing what to do next because something before you already did it. The past lives in structure. A tree remembers drought in its rings. Coral remembers ocean chemistry in its skeleton. Glaciers remember seasons in their layers. The earth remembers in sediments and scars. And you quietly, invisibly remember in the arrangement of proteins and the chemistry that decides which genes speak and which remain silent. For most of human history, people believed inheritance was more than blood. They spoke of ancestral strength, ancestral wounds, family curses, blessings that traveled through generations like weather. Modern language often dismisses this as superstition. Yet science, slowly and cautiously, has begun to confirm a version of it under different names. Genetics is the simplest doorway into this idea. Your DNA is not just a blueprint for your body. It is a record of survival. It contains adaptations shaped by the climates, diets, pathogens, and dangers your ancestors faced. The reason your body responds to stress the way it does is not only personal experience, it is evolutionary memory. A nervous system tuned by countless lives to recognize patterns of threat and safety. But genetics alone doesn't tell the whole story. The deeper intrigue lies in epigenetics. Changes not in the DNA sequence itself, but in the chemical markers that influence how genes are expressed. In other words, the same genetic code can behave differently depending on what has happened: stress, famine, abundance, trauma, exposure, nourishment. And some of these expression patterns can be passed to descendants, which means experience can leave a trace that outlasts the experiencer. A famine can echo through metabolism generations later. A prolonged period of danger can shape stress responses in children who never lived that danger. The body is capable of carrying forward not only what happened, but how to prepare for what might happen again. This doesn't mean we inherit specific memories like a film reel. It means we can inherit tendencies, biases in the nervous system, sensitivities, orientations. The body learns patterns and then teaches them forward chemically. That is the past living inside the present. There are experiments that make this feel suddenly real. In one widely discussed study, mice were trained to fear a particular scent by pairing it with a mild shock. Their offspring, who had never experienced the shock, also showed heightened fear responses to that same scent. Something about the association was transmitted. Again, not a conscious recollection, but a predisposition, a kind of biological whisper. If animals can inherit such tendencies, it isn't unreasonable to wonder what humans might carry. Not only the obvious evolutionary instinct's fear of heights, the comfort of warmth, the tendency to seek faces, but more complex inheritances shaped by culture and environment over long spans. The first civilization, if it existed, might not have left us a set of facts. It might have left us temperament, curiosity that refuses to die, the urge to build, the expectation that patterns exist, the hunger to map, measure, preserve. Those could be cultural habits worn so deep they began to shape biology epigenetic tendencies reinforced generation after generation until they became part of what it means to be human. And beyond epigenetics, there are other layers of bodily memory that make identity feel less individual than we assume. Consider the microbiome. The trillions of microorganisms that live in and on you, influencing digestion, immunity, inflammation, even mood and cognition. Many of these microbes are inherited through birth, contact, food, and environment. You are not a singular organism. You are an ecosystem, a walking community that has been assembling itself through lineages as surely as any family tree. Yourself is partly microbial, and microbial communities carry their own histories, adaptations to diets, climates, and local environments that can persist across generations. In that sense, inheritance is not only genetic, it is ecological. We inherit not only DNA, but companions. A civilization that understood this might have treated health as relational, not individual, an idea many traditional cultures already practice in their own frameworks. Food as medicine, soil as ancestor, water as kin. Again, it can sound mystical until you see how directly it aligns with biology. Your health depends on your relationships with unseen life. This makes the concept of ancestral memory even broader. The past may not live only in your genes. It may live in the community of organisms that has evolved with your species. A long co-adaptation, a shared history carried in microbes as much as in human chromosomes. And then there is the brain itself, often treated as the seat of memory, but increasingly understood as a distributed network rather than a single storage vault. Memories are patterns across neural connections, not isolated objects in a box. The brain preserves by redundancy, multiple pathways, multiple regions, overlapping representations. Even when one area is damaged, others can sometimes compensate. Resilience through distribution. Notice how this mirrors everything else we've been talking about. Soil networks, mycelium, human culture. The sky is shared archive. Memory seems to prefer distribution because distribution survives interruption. If the first civilization had wisdom, perhaps it understood this fundamental rule. Never store your future in one place. Spread it. Encode it in multiple mediums: story, ritual, landscape, habit, body. Let it survive through redundancy. That would explain why, even when history breaks, something always continues. A craft survives in a family. A song survives in a community. A method survives in the hands. An ethical intuition survives as taboo. A way of noticing survives as curiosity. Even when cities fall, the pattern persists. There's also the question of instinct, those sudden feelings that seem to arise without reasoning. The unease in certain kinds of silence. The comfort of a fire. The pull toward open water or away from it. The way some landscapes feel familiar even when you've never seen them. We often attribute these to personality or imagination, but some of them may be older than your own life. They may be evolutionary. They may be inherited predisposition shaped by environments your ancestors navigated for thousands of years. A people who lived near coasts may carry different tendencies than a people who lived on high plains. A lineage shaped by cold climates may respond differently to seasonality than one shaped by tropical rhythms. These are not strict rules, but soft influences, the past leaning gently on the present. Which means, the first civilization, if it was widespread or influential, might have shaped not only culture, but the very selection pressures that molded later populations. If their practices affected diets, settlement patterns, social structures, the biological echoes could still be present in us. The way we bond, the way we learn, the way we respond to uncertainty. In that sense, guidance could be literal. The first civilization steering the future not through messages, but through shaping the conditions that shaped us. And here we arrive at a humbling thought. Perhaps the difference between biological evolution and cultural inheritance is not as clean as we like to pretend. Culture alters environment. Environment alters bodies. Bodies alter culture again. It is a loop, a spiral, always. The past becomes the present, becomes the past, layered and recycled the way soil recycles leaves into new trees. If you've ever felt that humanity's biggest questions never change, who are we? Where did we come from? How do we live well? What is consciousness? You might be feeling the weight of this continuity. We keep returning to the same questions not because we are incapable of moving on, but because the questions are structural. They are how consciousness tests itself. Each generation re-asks them in new words because each generation must rediscover the answers for itself. That is how learning works at species scale. And perhaps the first civilization's true legacy was to spark that self-questioning deliberately to push humanity into a state where it could not stop reflecting. Once a species becomes self-aware enough to ask, it cannot return to simple living. It becomes a creature of memory and intention. It begins to build. It begins to preserve. It begins to worry about the future. Those traits can be seen as burdens, and sometimes they are. But they are also the engine of continuity. A species that preserves knowledge has a chance to outlast disaster. A species that can learn across generations can recover after collapse. So if ancestral memory is real in any sense, and science suggests it is, at least as predisposition, then the first civilization's guidance may be literally embodied in us, not as a secret map, but as orientation, the pressure to keep learning, the discomfort with ignorance, the urge to make meaning durable. You can feel this in the way children behave before they are taught what to value. They explore, they test patterns, they ask why until the adults run out of breath. Curiosity erupts naturally as if it were not a luxury but a biological imperative. That might be the inheritance. And if it is, then the first civilization is not behind us. It is inside us, moving through nervous systems, through instincts, through the quiet tendencies that shape our lives before we can name them. The past does not vanish. It becomes behavior. It becomes bias. It becomes longing. It becomes a certain kind of recognition when you see a stone circle under a wide sky and feel, without knowing why, that you have been here before, not in place perhaps, but in pattern. As the night deepens, consider your own body as part of the Earth's archive. Atoms recycled, microbes inherited, genes shaped by survival, chemistry carrying echoes. You're not a blank page, you're a continuation. And if guidance exists, perhaps it is nothing more, and nothing less than that continuity itself. The past leaning gently into the present, urging it to remember what it already knows how to become. There's a question that keeps returning, no matter how carefully we set it down. What if they never left? Not in the cinematic sense, no hidden doors and pyramids, no secret councils meeting under oceans, no dramatic reveal waiting for the right constellation. I mean something quieter, more honest, more consistent with how time actually behaves. What if the first civilization didn't survive as a city or a people, but as a method? What if it survived the way a river survives a flood, by changing shape while remaining the same motion? When we say a civilization disappeared, we usually picture ruins swallowed by forest, roads broken into weeds, names fading from memory. And yes, that happens. But disappearance is a matter of scale, A human lifetime is short. A few thousand years is long to us, but brief to rock. 100,000 years is long to rock, but brief to tectonics. Over enough time, even the most ambitious monuments become gravel. So if a civilization existed deep in the past tens of thousands of years ago, or more, and if it wanted to endure, it might have recognized a brutal truth. You cannot beat erosion by building harder. You can only beat erosion by building into processes that renew. Stone lasts, but stone still breaks. A system that heals can last longer than any material. We've already touched on this with soil and cycles, but here the thought becomes even more radical, not in a sensational way, but in a practical one. Perhaps the most advanced form of civilization is not a skyline. Perhaps it is integration. Imagine a society that learned to see itself not as separate from the planet, but as one of the planet's organs. Not rulers, not guests, participants in metabolism. They would treat water cycles, forests, coastlines, and atmosphere not as resources to be consumed, but as systems to be stabilized, because their own survival would be inseparable from the health of those systems. Their engineering would look like ecology. Their infrastructure would look like landscape. Their data storage might look like ritual. Their governance might resemble feedback loops rather than commands. From the outside, such a civilization might be hard to detect because it wouldn't build against nature. It would build as nature. And if it reached that level of integration, its disappearance might not be a collapse at all. It might be a transition, the boundaries of civilization dissolving into the planet's ongoing functioning. The society would become less like an empire and more like a pattern distributed across living systems. We have modern analogies that help us feel this. Think of how our technology has shifted. The most powerful systems in your life are often invisible. Algorithms deciding what you see, networks routing information, sensors regulating temperature, infrastructure humming quietly beneath your awareness. The more advanced the system, the less it needs to announce itself as machinery. Visibility is not a measure of power. Sometimes it's the opposite. The end point of sophistication might be seamlessness technology, indistinguishable from environment, so natural it disappears into the background. And there is a scientific idea that echoes this possibility: the Gaia hypothesis. The proposal that life on Earth interacts with the physical environment in ways that tend to maintain habitable conditions. It was controversial at first because it sounded too intentional, but even without intention, the evidence shows feedback. Microbes affecting atmospheric chemistry, forests influencing rainfall, oceans buffering temperature, ecosystems shaping climate at scale. The biosphere is not passive, it is active regulation. Now gently, without making claims, we can't consider the possibility that a sufficiently mature civilization could have learned to participate in that regulation deliberately, not by controlling the planet, but by cooperating with it, by tuning feedback loops, by designing landscapes that stabilize climate, by preserving biodiversity as a form of resilience, by aligning human activity with planetary thresholds. That would be a civilization that doesn't merely live on Earth. It lives as part of Earth's self-maintenance. If such a civilization existed long ago, its legacy would not be a set of ruins. It would be the persistence of habitability. It would be the continued stability of complex life despite catastrophes. It would look like nature. And that is the strange thing. If the most successful guidance is environmental integration, we might not recognize it because we call it just the world. We are used to thinking of intelligence as something housed in individuals, but nature repeatedly demonstrates intelligence without a single center. Ant colonies solving problems, slime molds optimizing paths, fungal networks distributing resources, ecosystems self-correcting. The mind is in the network, not in one organism. Scale that principle up, and it becomes conceivable, at least conceptually, that an entire biosphere could behave like a distributed intelligence, not conscious in the way humans are conscious, but responsive, adaptive, self-preserving. If the first civilization found a way to merge with that distributed intelligence to become part of the planet's decision-making through ecological design, then the line between them and Earth would blur. Over time, Their individuality would dissolve into system function. They wouldn't need monuments. Their presence would be in processes, rain patterns, soil fertility, species distributions, fire regimes, ocean currents, subtle stabilizations that seem natural because they are natural shaped, nudged, reinforced. And if they left behind direct traces, perhaps they left traces that are readable only when a later civilization reaches the right level of understanding. Not a hidden code, but universal principles. Symmetry, ratio, alignment, cyclic time. Messages that don't depend on language because they depend on the structure of reality itself. We already respond to these principles. We build with them. We find them beautiful. We return to them when systems fail because they work. That might be the first civilization's most effective strategy. Don't leave instructions in words. Leave instructions in forms that reality obeys, because reality does not forget its own rules. There's another angle to never leaving that is even quieter. Perhaps they never left because we are them in a changed form. Evolution doesn't always replace. Sometimes it absorbs. Your cells contain mitochondria organisms that were once separate bacteria, long ago, swallowed and integrated, now inseparable from what you are. A past life became a core function. What if human civilization did something similar at cultural scale? What if an early civilization's knowledge and orientation didn't vanish but became integrated into later humanity, so thoroughly that we stopped recognizing it as inherited? In that scenario, the first civilization isn't hiding in the ground. It's hiding in us, in our assumptions, our instincts, our insistence on measurement, our refusal to stop asking questions. We might be the continuation of their project the way a seed is the continuation of a tree. Different form, same lineage. And maybe that's why the idea of teachers in myth keeps recurring, because every generation is taught, even when it thinks it is inventing. Sometimes the teacher is a person. Sometimes the teacher is the sky. Sometimes the teacher is the soil. Sometimes the teacher is suffering. But teaching happens. The pattern survives by reappearing. Now, there is a more speculative thought that some people reach for here. The idea that a civilization could have transcended matter, existing as patterns of information, perhaps in fields we do not perceive. Physics already tells us that much of the universe is invisible. Dark matter and dark energy dominate, while ordinary matter is a smaller fraction. We don't know what consciousness ultimately is. We don't know where mind ends and world begins. But we don't need to rely on untestable claims to feel the core point. Absence of visible evidence does not automatically mean absence of influence. Influence can be systemic, ecological, cognitive, cultural, distributed, subtle, enduring. History contains moments that feel like gentle nudges. A manuscript surviving fire when everything else burns. A technique preserved by a tiny community. A seed bank of knowledge carried across a collapse. You can call these coincidences. You can call them luck. But the pattern of survival often favors redundancy and distribution. The same principles a wise civilization would choose. If the first civilization guided anything, perhaps it guided timing. Not through intention, but through the way systems evolve. The right idea arrives when conditions make it viable. The right ethic returns when extraction becomes unsustainable. The right technology reappears when need sharpens. Guidance as timing is indistinguishable from evolution, except it feels, from inside, like being nudged. And maybe that feeling is enough. Maybe the guiding force isn't a being. Maybe it's the continuity of memory, the persistence of patterns that keep resurfacing because they are selected for by time. In that view, the first civilization never needed to remain physically present. It needed to set certain patterns in motion and then allow the world to do what the world does. Repeat what works. Look at our modern direction. We are rebuilding, in digital form, the same kinds of distributed systems nature has used for ages. Networks, feedback loops, decentralized intelligence, adaptive learning. We build neural networks that mimic brains. We build the internet that behaves like mycelium. We talk about resilience, redundancy, sustainability concepts that echo ecological logic. Is that innovation? Yes. Is it also recognition? Possibly. We might be recreating unconsciously the same systemic intelligence the Earth has always embodied, and which a first civilization may have learned to cooperate with long ago. If that's where we're headed, then the first civilization's presence might be felt as an eventual convergence. Humanity returning, through technology and crisis and learning, to the ancient truth of integration. The lesson is simple, and it doesn't require mythology. You cannot survive by separating yourself from your life support system. You can only survive by becoming a good participant. So when you step outside at night and feel that strange sense of company, when you look up and feel both small and included, perhaps that feeling is not an illusion. Perhaps it's the nervous system recognizing its membership in something larger, the same membership the first civilization may have recognized. If recognition is the final step of guidance, then the first civilization doesn't need to reveal itself. It doesn't need to return in a ship or a prophecy. It only needs us to finally see what has been true all along. That civilization is not an object, it is a relationship. A relationship between mind and matter, between pattern and time, between human intention and Earth's living systems. If the first civilization never left, perhaps it's because it became that relationship itself. Quiet, invisible, persistent guiding, not by speaking, but by remaining woven into the way the world works. And maybe slowly, we are learning to listen at that scale. There's a moment, usually late at night, when the mind stops trying to hold everything apart. The categories soften. Ancient and modern blur at the edges. Us and them becomes less convincing. The world stops feeling like a collection of separate rooms and starts feeling like one long hallway dimly lit, stretching both ways, with doors opening and closing as you walk. If you've stayed with me this far, you can feel the threads we've been gathering: stone, sky, language, hands, soil, the pulse of rise and collapse, the whisper of invention, the body as archive, the possibility of integration. None of them stands alone. They braid. And when they braid, they start to resemble something simpler than any theory: a single long breath. Civilization, in this view, is not a sequence of empires. It is not a ladder. It is not even a timeline. It is a continuity of attention life learning how to remember itself across change. Stone remembers by enduring. The sky remembers by repeating. Language remembers by adapting. Hands remember by practicing. Soil remembers by transforming. History remembers by cycling. The body remembers by inheriting. And the mind remembers by returning to the same questions again and again, refusing to let them die. When you line those up, the idea of a first civilization shifts. It becomes less like a lost city and more like a first orientation. The earliest moment humans began to behave as a species that preserves, not merely survives, preserves. Because survival can be immediate. Preservation is long-term. It assumes a future. It assumes continuity. It assumes that what you do now will matter later. That assumption, quiet, audacious might, be the earliest foundation of civilization. And if it is, then the first civilization could have disappeared in every material sense, and still continue through the assumption itself. Because once a species learns to project itself forward, it cannot unlearn it. The instinct to leave traces becomes part of identity. Think of how small everyday acts reveal this inheritance. You take a photograph to keep a moment. You write a note to your future self. You save a file. You preserve a recipe. You teach someone a skill. You tell a child a story you heard as a child. You plant something knowing you won't be the one who harvests it. These are not grand gestures, but they are civilization in miniature. Memory made portable. And portability is the secret of endurance. The Earth has taught us this. The world changes too fast for any single form to last forever. Coastlines move, languages drift, forests migrate, ice comes and goes, but patterns, the way water finds gravity, the way sunlight marks seasons, the way life cycles nutrients, patterns survive because they can be carried by new mediums. They transfer. Civilization is the human version of that transfer. This is why progress so often feels like rediscovery. We don't move forward by abandoning everything old. We move forward by reassembling what works. We loop back to familiar shapes because familiar shapes are stable. We keep building triangles and arches because physics hasn't changed. We keep marking solstices because the sky hasn't changed. We keep telling flood stories because water still returns. We keep drawing spirals because growth still spirals. The continuity is so complete it becomes invisible. And that invisibility is what makes the first civilization hard to find. If its influence is everywhere, then it doesn't stand out as a separate artifact. It is the background, like the air. You don't notice air until it changes. You don't notice the continuity of civilization until something breaks, until a library burns, until a language dies, until a landscape is erased, until a skill is lost. Loss is the moment you realize what you were swimming in. But the story keeps moving because the system is resilient. It stores itself redundantly, in stones and stars, in bodies and soil, in rituals and hands. The knowledge doesn't exist in one vault. It exists in a web. And webs are hard to destroy completely. That might be the most comforting implication of all this. Not that catastrophe cannot harm us. It can, and it does. But that civilization is not a single fragile thing. It is a distributed phenomenon. It can be wounded, scattered, dimmed. But it tends to return, because its roots are deeper than any one city. Sometimes the return is slow. A generation that rebuilds without remembering why it builds. Another generation that relearns measurement. Another that relearns navigation. Another that relearns how to store and share knowledge at scale. Each era thinks it's making a new beginning. In truth, it's continuing the same motion. The first civilization may have been the first to understand this and to accept it. To stop trying to make permanence out of a single structure and instead make permanence out of a process. If they did, then their message was not, "We were here." It was keep going. Not as ambition, as stewardship. Keep the flame alive by passing it forward. Keep your attention sharp. Keep your curiosity awake. Keep your systems flexible. Keep your memory in more than one place. Keep returning to the patterns that sustain you. That is how a civilization survives its own collapse. And notice how closely this mirrors nature's own strategies. Life persists by redundancy. Seeds scattered widely, genes shuffled, ecosystems diversified. Nothing essential is stored in only one body. The biosphere survives because it distributes itself. Human civilization, at its best, does the same. We build archives and backups. We create education systems. We share discoveries globally. We store seeds in vaults. We preserve languages. We map genomes. We launch probes with messages on them. It can look like vanity. It can look like fear. But it is also the species practicing continuity. We are trying, in our own modern way, to do what the first builders did with stone, to send a signal forward through time. Remember, continue. And perhaps the most elegant part is this. Even when we fail at it, the attempt itself leaves traces. A broken monument becomes foundation stone for a later wall. A lost language leaves borrowed words in another. A collapsed city changes soil chemistry. A forgotten myth returns as a novel, a film, a dream. The continuum is not clean. It is messy. It is full of misunderstandings, misinterpretations, half-remembered lessons. But it continues anyway. That is what makes it feel alive. So what does it mean to live inside an unbroken story. It means the past is not behind you like a closed door. It is beneath you, inside you, beside you. It is in the patterns you instinctively trust. It is in the way you look at a night sky and feel compelled to name its lights. It is in the way you want your life to matter beyond your lifespan. It is in the urge to build something that outlasts you, even if it's just a kindness someone carries forward. If the first civilization still guides us, then perhaps guidance is not a force that pushes. Perhaps it's a current that carries. You can fight it, exhaust yourself, pretend it isn't there, or you can notice it and move with it. This is where the idea becomes personal, because you are not just a listener to this story. You are one of its mediums. Your mind is one more place where memory lives. Your choices become part of the archive. The way you treat the land, the way you pass knowledge, the way you preserve what matters, those are not small actions. They are how the continuum maintains itself. Civilization is not only governments and cities, it is the daily act of remembering on purpose. And when you look at the world that way, certain anxieties soften. The fear that everything ends. The dread that collapse means meaninglessness. Those fears don't vanish, but they become less absolute. Because the record is clear. Humanity has ended many times in many places, and yet it has continued. Not because it was invincible, but because it was capable of rebuilding from fragments. Fragments are not failure. Fragments are seeds. The night is a good time to let that settle. Night is when the world looks less like a machine and more like a living thing. Lights become constellations. Sounds become distant. The pace slows. You can feel your own breath as part of a larger rhythm. So, as we come to the end of this part, I want you to picture something simple. A person long ago stands under a sky untouched by electric glow. They place a stone, deliberately one stone, among many. They don't know your name, they can't imagine your world, but they can imagine a future in which someone will stand where they stand and look up where they look up and feel what they feel. They place the stone anyway, not as proof, as participation. And now, here you are, centuries and millennia later, doing the same thing in your own medium, listening, wondering, remembering. The stone in your world may be data, or a story, or a seed planted in a jar, or a lesson you pass to someone else. But the gesture is the same. That is the quiet continuum. Not a beginning, not an ending. A long breath the earth has been taking through us, steady and patient, under the same stars. Guidance is a delicate word. It can sound like control, like puppet strings, like fate written in ink you never agreed to read. It can sound like something outside you steering your life without permission. And if that's what guidance means, then it's reasonable to resist it. But there is another meaning, older, quieter, more honest. Guidance can mean orientation, not a command, but a direction you tend to face when the noise clears. A river is guided by gravity, not because gravity speaks, but because gravity is consistent. A seed is guided by light, not because the sun issues orders, but because the sun returns. In the same way, perhaps human civilization is guided by patterns that are simply more reliable than chaos patterns we learn, forget, and learn again, because the world keeps rewarding the same kinds of attention. This is why the idea of the first civilization still guiding us doesn't require proof in the strict sense to be meaningful. It's not a claim that demands belief. It's a lens, a way of looking at human history that makes room for continuity without pretending the record is complete. We live in an era that is trained to demand certainty. We're taught to treat uncertainty as weakness. But the truth is, the oldest wisdom on Earth has always been comfortable with not knowing everything. The ocean is not fully mapped. The seafloor is still largely unseen. The past is partly dissolved. Even our own minds are only partly visible to us. If you wait for perfect evidence before you allow wonder, you might miss the most human part of being alive. Wonder is not proof. It is an impulse toward relationship. So what do we do with the thought that the first civilization never truly vanished? That it changed form? That it may still be guiding us through patterns, instincts, and the world's own consistency? We hold it gently. We don't grip it like a weapon. We don't force it into a doctrine. We don't turn it into a conspiracy because conspiracies demand sharp edges, and the earth rarely speaks in sharp edges. We treat it like a stone warmed by sunlight, real, tangible, but not demanding. It is enough to let the question shape your attention, because attention is where guidance lives. If you begin to see civilization as continuity, rather than as isolated episodes, you start noticing different things. You notice how often people rediscover the same principles. You notice how resilient knowledge can be when it's embedded in practice. You notice how myths preserve ecological warnings. You notice how the sky has been our oldest teacher. You notice how soil carries memory. You notice how the body inherits tendencies. You notice how building, measuring, and preserving are not modern inventions. They are ancient habits. You begin to recognize that the first civilization, whether it was a specific culture or simply the first coherent orientation toward pattern, is still present whenever humans do what humans do best: pay attention, cooperate, and make memory durable. And then, if you allow the thought to settle, you may also notice something else: a responsibility. Not a heavy one, not an anxious one. A simple, quiet responsibility. If we are part of a continuum, then what we do becomes part of what continues. This is where the idea stops being abstract and becomes intimate. Because if civilization is a long conversation, then every person is a speaker. Every person is also a listener. The way you speak matters. The way you listen matters. The way you treat the world that sustains you matters. You don't have to build monuments to participate. You can participate through small preservations, teaching a skill, sharing a truth, protecting a patch of living ground, noticing the seasons, treating knowledge as something to pass forward rather than hoard. The first civilization, if it still guides, may be most visible in these small acts. Guidance not as grandeur, but as steadiness. And there's a kind of peace in that, because it means the world isn't only made of loss. Even when things break, something is carried. Even when names disappear, methods survive. Even when ruins are swallowed, soil holds the imprint. Even when languages die, rhythms persist. Even when a civilization falls, the pulse continues in new forms. That doesn't erase grief. It doesn't romanticize destruction. It simply widens the frame. It lets you see that endings are rarely total. The Earth is a master of partial survival. So are we. If you're listening tonight with a tired mind, if you came here because the world has been too loud, then maybe this is the most helpful part of the story. You don't have to solve the mystery to rest inside it. You can let uncertainty be a kind of shelter. You can let the idea of continuity soften your fear of impermanence. You can let the thought that nothing is lost, only transformed, settle in your chest like a slow breath. Because even if the first civilization never existed as we imagine, something like it still does. The first impulse toward meaning, the first decision to keep track, the first agreement to pass knowledge forward, that impulse is real. You can see it everywhere, and you are part of it. Sometimes the best way to honor the unknown is not to demand answers, but to live as if the question matters, to build carefully, to listen closely, to preserve what is worth carrying. If the earth is an archive, and it is, then we are both readers and pages, and as the night moves toward whatever comes next, sleep, dawn, another day. Let the story end the way the sky ends a night, not with a conclusion, but with a gradual shift, darkness thinning, shapes returning, a new cycle beginning without needing permission. Somewhere, under your home, under your street, under the roots and pipes and stones, there are layers of lives that looked up at the same stars. Their names are gone, but their attention remains in what they built, what they planted, what they passed forward. Maybe that is the only kind of immortality that ever made sense, to become part of a continuum so steady that even forgetting cannot break it. If you want to carry one thought with you into sleep, let it be this: you are not alone in time. Your curiosity is ancient. Your urge to understand is inherited. And the earth, patient as always, is still teaching through light, through soil, through the quiet repetition of patterns that refuse to stop being true. Rest inside that. Let the mystery be wide. Let the continuity hold you. Before we go, let's return to the place we started softly, without needing to retrace every step. You came here into this quiet corner of thought where curiosity doesn't have to perform, where questions can be held the way you hold something fragile and meaningful, not tightly, not fearfully, just carefully. And if your mind has been wandering through old stones and older skies, through language and soil, through pulses and whispers, then maybe you can feel it now, the way all of it was never really separate. It was one story told in different materials. Stone, because stone endures long enough for wonder to find it. Sky, because the sky repeats until even the forgetful learn. Language, because meaning survives when it can travel. Hands, because knowledge becomes real through motion. Soil, because the earth does not discard, only transforms. And the pulse, because everything alive learns through cycles. There is no requirement tonight to decide what is literally true. You don't have to make the first civilization into a map you can point to. You don't have to name it, date it, prove it. You can let it remain what it may have always been. A metaphor for continuity. A reminder that humanity did not arise out of emptiness, and that nothing we do begins entirely from scratch, because the world is full of inheritance, not only in blood and genes, not only in myths and rituals, but in the quieter inheritance of habit, the way we keep returning to the same questions, the way we keep building structures meant to outlast us, the way we keep looking up, measuring, aligning, searching for order, like it is something we once knew intimately. Maybe that is what guidance is, not a voice, a tendency, a subtle leaning of the species toward pattern, toward memory, toward meaning made durable. A reminder that even when we forget, we keep trying to remember. If you're ready to rest, I want you to imagine something very simple. Imagine the earth at night from far above, not as a globe of borders and names, but as a turning sphere of water and stone and cloud. A planet breathing heat into space, gathering light again, rotating with the patience of a body that has done this for billions of years. On that turning surface, a few lights flicker cities, towns, solitary houses. But beneath them is the older light, the moon's reflection on water, the faint shine of snow, the slow phosphorescence of coastal waves. Beneath all of it is the dark, and in the dark, the living systems continue. Roots trading minerals, insects moving through soil, microbes rewriting matter into future. And somewhere on that surface, long ago, someone stood under a sky with no electric glow and placed a stone where it would catch light at the right time. Not because they wanted to impress anyone, not because they expected applause, because they wanted the future to have a reference point, because they wanted time to be readable, because they believed quietly that someone would come after. Maybe that someone is you, not in place, but in gesture. Because tonight, you've done the same thing in your own way. You've given attention to the past. You've allowed a question to exist without killing it with certainty. You've participated in the oldest human behavior, keeping a small flame of wonder alive. That's how the continuum continues, not through grand conclusions, but through gentle attention handed forward. So as you settle deeper into pillow or chair, deeper into the quiet you've made for yourself, let the thought of the first civilization become less like a missing chapter and more like a presence in the margins, a whisper in the way your mind loves patterns, a soft echo in the way your body trusts cycles, The world outside will keep turning whether you solve the mystery or not. The stars will return. The sun will rise somewhere. The soil will keep transforming. And you, for a while, can let yourself be carried by that steadiness. If the first civilization still guides us, perhaps it guides us like this, by making the world reliable enough that memory can be rebuilt, by leaving patterns that welcome relearning, by ensuring that even after forgetting, the path back to understanding is still there, written in light, in seasons, in stone, in the patient architecture of the earth. Sleep doesn't end the story. It simply turns the page. And if you listen closer than language, you might feel the same quiet message that has been passing through time for longer than history has had a name. Continue. Remember what matters. Begin again, gently when morning comes.